Carol has it. Good morning.
Good morning, Lou. Good morning to you. Well, every picture tells a story. This is a beautiful one sent in this morning from one of our BBC weather watchers. Lovely rainbow in Gateshead. Now, some of us yesterday had torrential rain across the southeast. Today, in the southeast and East Anglia, there'll be a lot of sunshine around, but showers already in the north and the west will develop further and intensify in some parts as we go through the course of the day. By the afternoon, some of those showers across Scotland will be heavy and thundery, maybe with some hail, but in between there will be some sunshine. It's the same across Northern Ireland and northwest England, some heavy showers with some hail and some thunder here and there. In Wales, you could see the same as you could in the southwest, but in between all those showers and the fairly hit and miss, we will see some sunshine. But dry conditions as we push into the southeast with highs of 21. Now, through this evening and overnight, many of the showers will fade. We'll hang on to some in the north and the west. We'll also have some clear skies, but it's not going to be a cold night. In fact, temperatures staying in double figures. And then as we head on into tomorrow, again, we'll see some showers, a different distribution. In the west, we'll have something that bit brighter. Back to you, David.
Thank you very much for that news. Now, of course, we're into a new world now. If you've just joined us, a new day has dawned in Britain. I'm joined here by Diane Abbott and Daniel Hannan, and we'll be talking to them in a moment. But first of all, on the financial front, and in case you missed the story, which you can't possibly have done, I think, it's that the referendum led to the those who wish to leave winning by 4 percentage points over those who wish to remain in the EU. There have been various ramifications, and not least in the value of the pound and in the markets, but not just the currency markets, but the markets generally. Stephanie McGovern joins us from the Bank of England. What news do you have? What plans do they have, if any? Are they up and at work? Have they been up all night? What's going on?
Yeah, good morning, David. Morning, everybody. Yeah, they're certainly up and ready. I've seen quite a few people heading this morning into the Bank of England behind me because, of course, in the run-up to this referendum, the Governor, Mark Carney, said that the biggest immediate risk to global markets was the UK leaving the European Union. And they would do whatever they can, whatever action is necessary to reassure people and essentially keep things like inflation under control. So we know that Mark Carney now is preparing to speak. He says he's not going to speak until after David Cameron, after the Prime Minister has spoken, but then it won't be long before he will be telling us what the plans are for the Bank of England. Now, there's essentially two big issues here. One is around the volatility in the markets, particularly the currency markets, which we've seen overnight. I know Kamal's been keeping you on top of that, and the pound dropping so much could mean, of course, that inflation starts to head up as import prices become more expensive. It could put up the price of goods here and push inflation up, and the Bank of England has a target of 2% on inflation. If that tips over 2%, then we could see the Bank of England start to increase interest rates. But there are other concerns about that because, of course, we're still a country that's in a lot of debt, so interest rates could hit the economy hard as well. However, we're also hearing the likes of Nigel Farage saying this morning that this is good news for exporters. For a long time, exporters have had it quite tough while the pound has been so high, so it would be good news for them. The other issue, of course, is the banking stability. Do you remember the financial crisis back in 2008? How could we forget it, when the Bank of England had to intervene with quantitative easing, essentially pumping more money into the system to make sure that banks had enough to be able to borrow and lend and keep the economy in tick. So we're still waiting to hear, but let me tell you, David, it's not going to be long before we hear from Mark. We're going to be heading into his office shortly to hear exactly what the Governor of the Bank of England has to say.
Stephen, just tell me something. How do they detect whether this is just a panic reaction? Because we know markets are very volatile and they get a bit of bad news and they tumble and the good news comes and up it goes again because it's all people trading fast to make a profit for themselves. I mean, do you think these are substantial falls that are going to be sustained? Is that what you think the Bank of England think?
Well, as you saw last night, when initially we thought that we would be staying in the European Union, the pound headed up, didn't it? It hit 1.5 against the dollar at one point, and it started heading up, and since then has tanked again. You're right. On a day-to-day basis, we see the markets head up and down quite a lot, and it's very hard to get a picture in terms of when this might become stable. So you're right, it's very unlikely the Bank of England will take action straight away on trying to stabilise the currency markets. They'll probably wait to see whether it settles over the next few days, but it's more issues around reassurance that they do have a plan, and they will want to reassure people that the financial sector is not going to suddenly go to ruin because of what's happening now.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Well, we'll keep up with you, and if you get to the Governor's office, I'm sure we'll... will you have cameras in there with him? He's going to make a public statement. We'll hear from you.
All going on.
Excellent. We'll keep it going. This is a comment from the German Foreign Minister. The early morning news from Great Britain are truly sobering. It looks like a sad day for Europe and for the United Kingdom. We go now to Kasia Madeira in Warsaw for a reaction in the early morning sunlight there, a reaction to what's happened overnight here in Britain.
Well, David, it's a very sunny day here, but the outlook is far from it. This is a country waking up in shock. The main priority is what happens to the nearly 1 million Polish nationals living in the United Kingdom. They make up, of course, the largest non-British national group in the UK. What happens to their status? What happens to their jobs? What happens to their freedom of movement? What happens to the ability of their children to go to school? There are so many unanswered questions at the moment that I have to say it's been very, very strange watching the events unfold here, because there is just a palpable state of unease. Now, all day yesterday, the news bulletins, the newspapers were covering this story, what was happening in the United Kingdom. And their main point was, keep your fingers crossed. Government ministers, politicians from the opposition, everybody saying, keep your fingers crossed for the UK. They really wanted Britain to remain, because ultimately they have so many of their nationals in the UK, and what happens to them is of their ultimate concern. So a sense of shock at the moment. We're waiting for official reaction.
Because it has to be said that during this whole campaign and the ferocious argument that's gone on, I can't think that any Brexiter said that those Polish people who are currently in the United Kingdom would be expelled. I don't think anybody's talked of expulsions. It's controlling new immigration they've talked about. So on that basis, there should be no fears for the 1 million or so Polish people who are living and working in Britain now.
The point is, they feel unwelcome. It was such a ferocious, as you say, debate that they feel now unwelcome. They feel they'll be apprehensive. Of course, there are many Poles who will stay in the United Kingdom, and it will take time before any negotiations are made as to what happens officially to their status. But the overall feeling is, why did this happen? Were they the cause of this? And what is also a question that I was hearing a lot on the news bulletins in this country is, this was a decision that was going to affect so many Poles in the UK, Poles in this country as well. Don't forget, Poland is one of the biggest beneficiaries from the EU budget. But this was a decision that was being taken not by Poles. It was completely out of their hands. And there was a sense of uselessness, perhaps, is one way of putting it, but a sense of the inability of physically making a decision because it was out of their hands, and yet it affects so many people.
Well, Kasia, thank you very much indeed. I'm joined here at this table by Diane Abbott, the Labour MP for Hackney North, Shadow International Development Secretary, and Daniel Hannan, Conservative MEP for South East England, for years and years and years, 1999.
Yeah, not for much longer now, of course.
Well, you don't know that.
No, that's true.
How long it will take.
That's true.
Just about this campaign and what we've been hearing about the outcome, how much do you think it was a narrow issue of the EU or not the EU, which is what you were campaigning on? And how much was it about wages being flat, too much immigration, all sorts of other issues that you managed to get on your side and direct towards leaving the EU without it actually being that specific issue, that constitutional issue?
No, but what was very specific was what was on the ballot paper. Should Britain remain a member of the EU or leave the EU? That's the one clear mandate that we have. And although we now have a clear verdict from the British people, which I'm delighted about. I feel very, very proud to be British today, to see the way we stood up to all the threats and the hectoring and the bullying. We should also take account of the fact that 48% of our fellow countrymen voted to remain. And so in implementing the verdict, we need, wherever possible, to try and build a consensus, to try and carry people with us. We need to recognise that 2 of the 4 constituent nations of the UK voted to remain. The UK is a partnership. We need to give due weight to their voices. And of course, we don't want to act precipitately. We want to act wherever possible with the consent and agreement of our European allies. It's important to stress that reclaiming our laws doesn't in any sense mean walking away from our friends in Europe. We're still going to be constructively engaged, but on the basis of repatriating jurisdiction.
And you did say during the campaign that you didn't think the markets would be spooked by Brexit. It looks as if they are spooked.
Well, no, I think they were spooked, frankly, by some of the aggressive talk we had during the campaign about bombs under the economy and so on. I think once people realise that what we're talking about is a phased repatriation, a cumulative recovery of power within the context of continuing free trade with Europe, that on our side nobody is talking about trade barriers, nobody is talking about tariffs, and I don't really think you'll find anyone doing so on the other side either, that probably 85% of our economic relations with the EU will remain in place, and when eventually Brexit takes effect, that'll be the beginning of when we start disapplying some of the more burdensome regulations, but we'll still keep a number of them for reasons of economy of scale. I think when the markets understand that, then this present overreaction that you're seeing will very quickly be reversed.
Many people voting to leave will have been persuaded by your advertisement on the side of your bus that we send £350 million a week to the EU, and that could be spent on the national health and other things. How long will it take before that happens? Before the money is repatriated? I mean, next week?
After? I'm afraid it won't be next week or next year, because getting out of the EU is something that we need to get right. We've been in for 43 years, and I am very happy to wait 2 or 3 years if that means getting the terms of exit favourable to us, but also fair to our allies on the continent. It's absolutely critical that we don't rush into something for the sake of it, that we get a settlement that is durable here, that is fair to our allies, that shows that we're still engaged in the sense that we're military allies, we have open markets and so on, but that allows us to begin to take back power. And I think the vast majority of people who just voted to leave and who I've spent most of my last 4 months with pretty solidly campaigning, I think they understand that. What they wanted was to bring back control. But people are grown up and they understand that this isn't something that can be done tomorrow.
And how long before a British government can say they do have the method or the weaponry for controlling immigration and will reduce it, like David Cameron promised he would, to the tens of thousands, to 100,000, in fact. I mean, is that actually going to happen, or is that also something that's postponed?
I mean, no one has ever suggested that there's going to be no immigration. No, and by the way, thank you for making the point about the status of EU nationals. There will be EU nationals watching this programme now, and I want to, again, underline no one has suggested any change in their status. The only change they will see is that they no longer vote at European or local elections. I think in terms of migration from the EU, the one thing that we can change as a result of coming out is that we will no longer be citizens of the European Union. Citizenship of the European Union gives you a legal entitlement to reside and vote in another country, and it gives you the right to be treated the same way as a national of that country for the purposes of things like university tuition fees, welfare claims, and so on. That, I think, is going to change. But frankly, if people watching think that they have voted and there is now going to be zero immigration from the EU, they are going to be disappointed. Of course, there is still going to be immigration. There are still going to be people coming here to work. Right. And you will look in vain for anything that the Leave campaign said at any point that ever suggested that there would be any kind of border closure or drawing up of the drawbridge. All we're asking for is some control over roughly who comes in and roughly in what numbers. All right.
Diane Abbott, as a staunch Remainer, what do you make of what Daniel's just said? I mean, it seems to be a picture of a gentle move to a rather different prescription with the British government at last able to decide for itself what it does.
This is a nicer, more reasonable version of Brexit. But the most important thing to say is this vote tonight is a roar of defiance against Westminster elites. Many of those voters were Labour voters. We have to listen very carefully to what they were trying to say to us. And there was a lot of talk about immigration. I think in many cases immigration was a proxy for other discontents. Labour market insecurity, their children's future, what's happening to the health service. But I don't deny this is the most momentous vote of my political lifetime, and we have to listen carefully to what the electorate is saying.
A bit late to listen now, because you're out of the EU, which you wanted to stay in.
Well, I think one of the things we now know is that the leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn's position on Europe, which was always sceptical, was actually closer to the national mood than any other leader of a major party. And that puts him in a strong position to be a voice for working people as we go forward with these negotiations.
I never quite understood what he meant when he said he was 7.5 out of 10 in favour of staying in. He's now got 2.5 to play with.
How do you think he voted? Go on. You could see it in his face as he came out, couldn't you?
What he meant by 70% was he wanted to remain and reform. And I still think that was the right position.
Do you think he's pleased by what's happened?
You can't be pleased, but you have to
Why
respect...
can't you be pleased? Daniel Hannon's pleased.
I'm delighted. I've been working for Today for 26 years.
Nigel Farage
It's
is
morning
pleased.
again in Britain.
Well, Jeremy is neither Nigel Farage or Daniel Hannon. This is going to be an extremely challenging situation, and one of the biggest challenges is to bring people together. I don't believe Jeremy is pleased, but we have to rise as the leader of the Labour Party and those of us in the shadow cabinet, we have to rise to the challenge of both listening to the electorate and bringing people together.
But you must be pleased, Diane, with the way they said no to all the banks and all the politics. I mean, isn't there a bit of you that feels very proud to be British today, that people
You don't
defied...
like experts either, Daniel.
The bullying and the hectoring and the scare stories that we had from all of these big finance...
You think
that people stood up to it and their common sense was proof against it?
The Institute for Fiscal Studies said there's going to be a gap of between 20 and 40 billion, 30 billion. The Chancellor of the Exchequer said there's going to have to be an emergency budget if we left. Do you think all that's going to happen, Dan?
Some of these figures were highly speculative. It's clearly...
We're wrong, just a joke.
Speculative, because they're based...
What's a speculative figure when you're talking about the economy?
Speculative, based on certain models of what will happen.
And did you believe them yourself?
Nobody really knows what's
going to happen. Did you believe them?
I believe it's going to be a very challenging situation.
Did you believe them, or do you think it was a mistake and the fear tactics which played so well for the Leavers were being used by the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Prime Minister? Is that one of the flaws in it?
I believe, and the leader of the Labour Party believes, that this Project Fear stuff was completely overdone and didn't help us in the end.
Right. Werner Bogner, now you've heard the various versions around this table, and it seems that almost anything can happen. People can decide to invoke Article 50 and leave immediately, or, as Daniel says, you can start discussions, you don't need to do anything, you can take it gently and gradually ease your way, and that's all true, isn't it? There's no absolute way. It's only an advisory referendum. You don't have to do anything.
No, I don't think that's right. I think Diane Abbott's right to say it's the most momentous event, certainly for many years, and more momentous than the general election. And it's momentous because the people, as a result of a grassroots insurgency, have given the government an instruction. And to some extent, that is now out of the hands of politicians. And listening to Daniel Hannon and Liam Fox, I sometimes almost think they're so surprised at having won, they almost wish they hadn't. And they're not following out the logic of the Brexit position, which is that
we were saying this all the way through.
Which is that Britain is to leave the European Union. The dynamic behind it is that there should be control of EU immigration, that we should leave as soon as possible, and that preferably this process should be in the hands of people who believe it.
Sorry, who said as soon as possible?
No, I think this is what the public view. You, in your question earlier, said, when are we to cease paying the £350 million? When is immigration going to be controlled? This, I suspect, is the view of the British public. And I argued earlier there was a logical case for a general election because Parliament is clearly so unrepresentative, because the only party which recommended a Brexit vote has one MP, and that is UKIP. I didn't think there would be a general election because the political class don't want it.
Three-quarters of the House of Commons wanted to stay in. But we'll come back to that. But let's, for the benefit of people who've just got up and joined us and are hearing this news, let's have all the news insofar as we can present all aspects of it, and we'll come back here after that. Here's Louise Minchin.
David, thank you very much. Good morning. Britain has voted to leave the European Union. The Leave campaign has so far taken 52% of the vote. It's now impossible for Remain to overtake it. There have been strong wins for Leave in North East England and in the Midlands. Scotland and Northern Ireland voted to remain in the EU. The Conservative MP Liam Fox, who supported the Leave campaign, said a period of calm was now required.
It's going to be some time before we leave the European Union, and we'll have a period where we can disentangle ourselves. We want to leave on good terms. We want to cooperate where it's in our mutual interest to do so, and we need to have a period of stability. And to that end, I would like to see the Prime Minister today announce that he will be staying on so that we don't add political instability into the mix.
The Labour MP Chuka Umunna, who campaigned for a Remain vote, says the result has exposed divisions within Britain.
This is a big thing for our country. And what this has exposed is a lot of division, and there's a lot of talk as if this is an overwhelming win. It isn't. There's 48% of people on the current projection who did not vote for this. Now, the challenge for people in this context is how to lead and bring our country together.
Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has suggested that the Leave vote will reignite demands for an independence referendum there after all 32 Scottish local authorities returned majorities for Remain. Ms Sturgeon said the EU vote made clear that the people of Scotland see their future as part of the European Union.
I'm not sure I'd quite dare do this, but Gus O'Donnell is down at Westminster, former Cabinet Secretary to Blair and Brown and Cameron. And Gus, I want to come to you, but do you mind very much if we just do something first? If you can just say that, because we want to hear about procedure from you, which is very important. But first, Sarah Wollaston has been waiting a long time, and she, of course, was an important switcher, and she's with Emily.
A Tory MP and a GP, and for people waking up this morning, Sarah, they are saying it has happened. There is real shock there, and I wonder what that feels like for somebody who has gone from Brexit to Remain, whether a bit of you was left in Brexit or whether you're...
No, I mean, one of the things I realised was that if I woke this morning and Britain had voted to leave, it wouldn't be a sense of freedom or that this was some Independence Day, but that actually we'd lost something and a sense of real sadness and concern for the future. But my job now as a politician isn't to sort of quibble about the result, but to actually implement it, because Parliament's been given a clear instruction here. And this has been a divisive campaign, and now it's the time for us to try and bring people together and put this into action in a way that, as far as possible, delivers a positive way forward.
Do you believe it will actually happen? I mean, some people are already saying there will be 2 years of negotiation and then we'll be granted some sort of associate status, which puts us in the common market, in the single market, without really taking us out of the EU at all. What do you think happens now?
We're in a period of great uncertainty, and the point is there are 27 other partner nations now who will be having the key say in our status as well. So we need to be very careful in the language we use. We need to make it clear that we're not walking away from Europe, we're coming out of the European Union, but we do want to maintain close partnership and ties with our European neighbours.
But what do you think that we are missing? Because Dan Hannan has just spoken of the sense of liberty and gain, and you only see it as loss.
I'm afraid I see this as being a loss, but clearly the majority of the country see it as a gain. But we do need to be careful about how we're speaking to those around the country who didn't vote to leave. And I was very glad to hear him refer, for example, to the position of those within the EU who are currently living in this country. And I think, for example, of NHS staff and social care staff. There are 130,000 people working in our NHS and social care who qualified in Europe. And I think we need to send a very clear message to them that we really do value what they do and we'd like them to stay, and that this isn't going to mean that they would have to leave. And that needs to be a really clear, reassuring message, I think, that's sent out. And also about the language we use. I think we have to be very careful that this isn't triumphalist in its language, but we try and bring people together.
Do you think that 2-year period might lead to many more workers from overseas come in thinking, well, this is our last chance before the drawbridge gets pulled up?
Well, we don't know. As I say, this is one of the problems with voting to leave, is that there will be a period of uncertainty over the next 2 years, because we also know, for example, that some of those concessions that were negotiated by David Cameron, such as the being able to reduce the amount of benefit that is paid to those who come and live here for the first 4 years, that now won't come into place. So yes, we are in a period of great uncertainty, and I think the right thing to do now is to have some stability for David Cameron to stay at the helm for the time being, and to actually have a little pause before we rush into doing anything next. But there are clearly an instruction has been given to Parliament that we will be leaving the European Union.
What about this Brexit budget? Do you expect that to happen? Would you support it?
Well, I think that we need to, as I say, we are in a period of uncertainty. I think that over the next few days, the government will have to sort of see what happens with the economy, and I think it would be too soon to implement an emergency budget of that nature.
But you want them both to stay on?
I think that what we don't need right now is immediate resignations. I'm sure that at some point there will be a change, probably leading us into the negotiations, but I don't think that should happen immediately. I do hope that we're not going to see David Cameron come out and resign this morning, because I think that would add to the uncertainty, and I think that he'll be a voice of calm and reason as we enter this very uncertain period.
Busy day ahead. Sarah Wollaston, thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
David.
You see on the bottom right of the screen there that the Leave campaign is now leading by 1,223,000 odd votes. So it's well ahead there. We have 2 council areas still to come. But what people will be asking, and we've been asking around this table, is what happens? Now, one man has been at the Cabinet. He's the Cabinet Secretary from 2005 to 2011. He sits right at the heart of government. And he was there under Tony Blair, he was there under Gordon Brown, he's been there under David Cameron. So he served all 3 masters. Gus O'Donnell, what would be happening right now at coming up to 7 o'clock in number 10?
Well, there will have been work on contingency plans for just this sort of event. They'll be worrying about the volatility in the markets and hoping that that will calm down. There's not much they can do about the pound falling. That will get to its level. But they'll be thinking about making sure there aren't unstable markets, let's put it that way. And then on the political front, we need to sort ourselves out to get a negotiating position so that we can sort out how do we exit from the European Union. For example, when do we trigger Article 50? Now, if I were Cabinet Secretary, I'd be saying there's no great rush about that, and I'm glad to hear some of your guests saying exactly the same, because this is a 2-year process, and believe me, this is not a simple process. It was designed, in a sense, to make leaving very difficult and not easy for the leaving country. So I will be holding off on that and waiting until we have a settled government that can give clear direction to implement the will of the people on how we leave.
But the Prime Minister said that maybe this was just a threat, but I mean, he said that if the vote was to leave, he would leave. He would invoke Article 50. You would be saying to him if you were there, actually, Prime Minister, you don't need to. Well, it's obviously that he doesn't actually need to, except for political reasons. The country have voted, and they'll be impatient with the Prime Minister, you know, who they've, in effect, they don't like very much because they didn't go along with his view, who says, oh, well, I'm actually not going to do much for a bit.
Well, I mean, the question will be, does the Prime Minister decide that he wants to stay on and lead the negotiating period? What I'm saying is, when you trigger the Article 50, which is basically a letter from the Prime Minister to the Council of the European Union, you start that 2-year clock going. I wouldn't be in any rush to start that off. We know where we're going. The people have spoken. There's no question of not going, of not exiting. The question is really, how do you do it and when do you start that formal process? Because actually Article 50 is the only legal way to leave. You know, we've signed up to a treaty that says that's how we leave.
And in effect, you could sort of negotiate it all before you invoke this "we want to leave" article, and then leave a month later, couldn't you? You don't have to wait the 2 years. You could do all the negotiation before, giving yourself time to think it through and talk to all your former partners in Europe.
Remember, it takes two to tango. We might think that, but the European Union might say, actually, we have a process for leaving. We specified it in the treaties. You signed up to those treaties. So let's get on and start doing this within the framework of Article 50.
Of course, 2 years is a very, very short time in European negotiations, isn't it? Most things seem to take 10 or 15 years to get done.
Yes, I think I pointed out some time ago that it took Greenland 3 years to sort out its exit, and they only had one issue, fish, and rather fewer people than watch most European football matches in the Euro 2016. So
take us back inside the cabinet room. You have a prime minister who's fought throughout very hard and said, listen to all the experts, listen to the Bank of England, listen to the IBS. You have a Chancellor of the Exchequer who's said it's going to damage GDP, we're going to have a deficit, the GDP is going to fall by 30 billion. We're going to have to put up taxes. Can those two people negotiate this, or would you be saying, Prime Minister, I think actually it'd be wiser to have different people do it who aren't quite as committed as you have publicly been to not taking this step?
Well, I think that's a call the Prime Minister himself will have to make.
No, but you'd have to say something.
Chancellor.
You'd have to say something as Cabinet Secretary, wouldn't you, about what was advisable? I mean, you're not there now, so you can speak freely.
Well, what I would be saying is it's really important that we get the civil service will need to be directed. What are just as they were clear when the Prime Minister when the government had a clear position that we were remain in, so they were working with the government on that. We now need a clear position from the government as to what's the form of leave. So, you know, access to the single market, question about free movement of labour, all those sorts of issues. We need that negotiating position to be sorted out. And the question is, who's going to do that? And I suspect that that's the government that's going to be around for a very long time. So I think the Prime Minister will want to think about whether he's the right person to do that, or whether, you know, he will want to say, look, you know, I did my renegotiation, the people have spoken, so I am now going to manage an orderly period where we'll move on to a new set of people who might do this negotiation.
What, you mean I'll leave it to Boris?
Who he leaves it to is actually a matter for the Conservative Party. If he decides that he wants to start a leadership process, then it's first of all the Conservative MPs who get to do a shortlist, which then goes to the party. So,
but, Gus, one other thing. I mean, what kind of a shock is this to the civil service, the people who were much derided during this campaign, the Treasury and all those so-called experts who thought of themselves as experts and maybe are experts? What kind of shock is it to them to suddenly have to change tack? Are they quick on the uptake? Will they already now be thinking in a different mindset? Or will there be a kind of total confusion for a year or two while they work out where the hell they stand?
No, not in a different mindset. I mean, I think the work they did was very clear. They were in support of a government that had a very strong position, which was we should remain in. If the government's position is that we are leaving, which it obviously will be now, they will work hard to get the very best deal for Britain in terms of leaving. So that'll be fine. The things that were said by Treasury and all the rest of it, I think are actually things we're going to have to grapple with. It is difficult. There are likely to be economic difficulties. The predictions of market volatility have indeed turned out to be true. So the question is, how can we manage all of those difficulties as best we can? And that's what they have to do now.
Gus O'Donnell, thank you very much indeed. Thanks for joining us from Westminster. Shall we now just have a look, because people will be joining us at this time, just coming up to 7 o'clock, at the story of what happened in this referendum?
Yes, David, let's go back to the maps, and you can see here on the floor the map of the UK as the colours came in during the night. So blue for leave and yellow for remain, and in the end it wasn't enough. Scotland, Northern Ireland and London voting for remain was not enough to swing it. And I'll show you why that was. If I colour the map in for leave, and I darken the blue where the leave vote was strongest, you can see where it really packed a punch. So, for example, light blue in Scotland, where Leave was very weak, but the north of England, northeast and northwest, very, very strong for blue. And then the east of England, particularly East Anglia around here, the Thames Gateway, and then London, very, very light because not much was going on there for Leave. And the question through the night was, would those votes in London actually come through and turn it around? And they never really did in sufficient numbers because the Leave vote was just too strong. Take a look at our proportional map here, and I'll explain a bit further. So in each counting area, we've placed the stalk, and the stalk is in the colour of the side that won, blue for Leave and yellow for Remain. And where the stalk is high, it means they won by a large amount. So you see here, Edinburgh, for example, big majority to Remain there. And then in parts of the Midlands, East Midlands, West Midlands, lots of votes being packed away for Leave. But the really heavy numbers in London here for Remain. So let me take you in closer to this map. Let's go to the northeast. And here we saw some really remarkable results. The very first big result was this one here. Now, it's that very small yellow rectangle, cube, which should have been, we thought, a much bigger vote Remain for Newcastle. But Newcastle only just went Remain, and that was a sign very early on that things were going badly for the Remain side. The Leave side, meanwhile, packed away some absolutely extraordinary results. This is Durham here. Look at the height. A lot of people in Durham. It's not just the city, it's the county council boundaries voting here. And an awful lot of votes piling up for Leave in the northeast of England. Really impressive there. And elsewhere too. The West Midlands now. So have a look at this. So Warwick is the lone yellow rectangle there. The stalk that's yellow was Warwick, but not much else really to write home about for Remain, and some really thumping victories in the West Midlands for Leave, in Dudley, for example, and Walsall. Look at the height of some of these. The height, remember, represents the amount of votes that Leave won by. So the West Midlands was extraordinary, and I think just in the middle here we can see Birmingham. Interestingly, Birmingham had the biggest number of voters in its counting area, bigger than anywhere else in the country, 700,000. Problem was they basically cancelled each other out. So there wasn't much of a majority for Leave, but that was to Leave's advantage because Birmingham was expected on paper to go Remain. So the fact that Leave won at all in Birmingham was remarkable, and any sense of impact of the Remain vote in Birmingham just didn't happen. OK, we move on. East Midlands. Again, have a look here. So lots and lots of Leave victories. That's what's happening here. You can see the yellow is Leicester and Rushcliffe, but Boston on the East Coast had the biggest majority, something like 80% voting Leave. We had it down as the most Eurosceptic counting area. We were right to. It was. It turned out that way. And you can see these blue bars piling up in so many parts of the country. That is how Leave won. Now, London. Let's just have a look at these London boroughs here, 33 of them, and look how many went Remain. But it actually wasn't enough. They managed to not clinch victory in places like Barking and Havering and Bexley, but they also didn't put on enough votes across all of these London counting areas, these boroughs. Yes, Lambeth had a huge majority to Remain, that would have helped, but places like Hounslow were much closer. So London didn't come to the rescue of Remain in the UK. It was about 60-40 in London for Remain. It was about 60-40 for Leave in the rest of England. It was an unequal match in the end, and that map shows you why the UK has voted to leave the EU. David.
Thanks very much. Emily.
To Tim Farron, the Lib Dem leader. I know you described yourself as sad and angry right in the middle of that Remain camp, Tim, but when you look at the picture that Jeremy's shown you, all those big metropolitan boroughs, all the places like Newcastle, like Birmingham, like Sheffield, that were expected to be solid Remain weren't. What went wrong then?
Well, I'm not all that bothered about doing a kind of an analysis of the individual nature of the results brick by brick. The reality is we wake up this morning to a Britain that complies with the vision that Nigel Farage has set out, and that's not the Britain I believe in. And whilst I fully accept the result, it's important to do that in a democracy, I do not believe for one moment that we should be turning our back on the kind of outward-looking, decent, inclusive, internationalist Britain that Liberal Democrats believe in. So this is a morning where I am, frankly, utterly gutted and heartbroken. Totally, it's beyond party politics, this, but it's also a moment where I think I am in no mood for giving up. I am in no mood for thinking this is the kind of Britain I am going to accept. The Britain I believe in, the Britain that 3 out of every 4 young people voted for, is the one which does stand tall in the world, that promotes prosperity, working with others, that wants to believe in building peace and being a good neighbour, not being isolated, fearful, angry and alone. So I accept the result, but by golly, I don't agree with it.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like you accept it. When you talk about those who haven't voted to remain in the EU, your suggestion is they are not decent.
Well, what we've had over the last 20 years, I don't think that for 1 minute. The British people have every right to make the decision, and Liberal Democrats have a habit of not coming first in elections, and I absolutely accept the outcome. But where I do point the finger is over the last 20 years, people like David Cameron, Conservative ministers and MPs, every last one of them, who has cheaply derided the European Union for a quick headline, has stocked up in the bank this kind of well of distrust against the EU. And frankly, although I've stood shoulder to shoulder with people like Harriet Harman, Gordon Brown, Andy Burnham, great people who've pulled the shift in this campaign, I absolutely accuse Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour leadership of utter spinelessness in not getting involved in this campaign for Britain's very soul and very future. Well, this is a moment, I think, where British politics changes, where progressives who want that better kind of Britain need to start working together and to stop being spoken down to by the extremists in both the Labour and the Conservative parties.
You think Jeremy Corbyn's going to go or should go?
I think he has let the country down massively. You look at those areas that did not deliver for Remain, they were the areas that Labour were supposed to deliver, and it was because of his abject failure to take this seriously that has led us into this position, along with the spinelessness also of a Conservative government that limped into this situation and couldn't present a positive argument. We tried hard, very hard throughout this campaign to be positive, uplifting about Britain's role in the world, and it's one of the reasons why 3/4 of young voters voted to Remain. What a tragedy that other voters have chosen to damage their future.
Truth is, David Cameron would have preferred, probably, not to have had this referendum. He expected, on one level, the Lib Dems to be stopping him.
Maybe he did, but the reality is that in the case of David Cameron and Boris Johnson, you've got 2 Conservative politicians here who have both taken positions in this referendum, both to have it and then indeed to lose it, from the Remain point of view, purely for their own personal career benefit, not for the country's good. And it's about time we had politicians who stood up for what was in the interest of the country, the whole country, and our role in the world, rather than just politicking and seeing if you can get yourself to the next election.
Would you be surprised if Scotland went for another referendum now?
Well, there shouldn't be another referendum in Scotland. There's enough chaos as it is, with the pound tanking. The last thing Scotland or the rest of the United Kingdom needs to add to that self-inflicted recession with additional internal disarray. Now is a time for unity. This is a divided country. Let's not make it more divided.
Thanks for coming in, Tim Farron.
Thank you.
The last result came in and it was Cornwall voting to leave, 56%, Remain 40, whatever the opposite of that is, 43.5, 44%. So here is the final result for the United Kingdom. Here are the actual numbers of how people voted yesterday. 17,410,742 to leave, 16,141,241 to Remain, and 1 million and a bit majority for those who want to leave. Well, we'll go on looking at the results of all this. We will be talking to Jeremy Corbyn. I hope you heard Tim Farron say that he'd failed to deliver for the Labour Party, and we'll be talking about that. But let's now have a full catch-up of the news and the weather. Here's Louise Minchin.
Thank you, David. Very good morning. Britain has voted to leave the European Union. There have been strong winds for leave in North East England and in the Midlands. Scotland and Northern Ireland voted to remain in the EU. Our political correspondent, Eleanor Garnier, reports.
Well, at 20 minutes to 5, we can now say the decision taken in 1975 by this country to join the common market has been reversed by this referendum to leave the EU. We are absolutely clear now that there is no way that the Remain side can win. It looks
Watch and listen carefully. This is history in the making.
The British people have spoken, and the answer is we're out.
It's unbelievable, isn't it? Change the face of Europe!
And these were the celebrations just moments before the BBC called the result.
This will be a victory for real people, a victory for ordinary people, a victory for decent people.
With the pound plunging, Remain campaigners warned of turmoil ahead.
This moment, this is a seismic moment for our country that goes far beyond all the personalities. There's going to be a lot of chat what happens to David Cameron. This is a big thing for our country. And what this has exposed is a lot of division, and there's a lot of talk as if this is an overwhelming win. It isn't. There's 48% of people on the current projection who did not vote for this.
But this prominent Leave campaigner called for cross-party cooperation.
We have a responsibility, and that responsibility is to act in the best long-term interests of this country.
It wasn't long after polls closed before Leave started marking up huge wins.
Ladies and gentlemen.
Across the northeast, results soon showed Leave doing consistently better than predicted. A big win in Hartlepool and pushing Remain into a narrow victory in Newcastle.
65,404.
A much smaller win than expected.
Votes cast in favour of Leave.
Away from the north of England, in Basildon in Essex, another big win for Leave. And another count with a big turnout at 74%. And in Flintshire, just as across the rest of Wales, voters backed Brexit. But Scotland voted emphatically to stay in the EU, though the overall result will lead to renewed calls for a second referendum on Scottish independence. After counting was completed, Northern Ireland voted to remain. And it looks like London will be the only region of England to back staying in the EU. Parliaments across the European Union will now be busy for years. Britain has voted to leave the EU, to tear up the settlement the country's had for decades, unleashing perhaps huge opportunity, perhaps huge risk, or perhaps both. Ella Naganya, BBC News.
And with Britain voting to leave the EU, all eyes this morning are on number 10 Downing Street, and Laura Kunzberg, who was here in the studio until half an hour ago, has gone down there. Laura, good morning again. What's the news from behind you?
Well, the street is absolutely packed. I think I can show you the pictures of not just, of course, the British press, but, of course, many, many members of the international press filling up Downing Street, the Prime Minister's official residence this morning. Huge anticipation here. We're not entirely sure when, but we expect before 8 o'clock, when the financial markets open, see David Cameron come out of the door and come to make some kind of statement. Now, we do not know in any detail what he's going to say, but two broad themes I am sure he will address, and sources have suggested to me are at the forefront of his mind. The first, he will urge the need for stability after this tumultuous result, which of course has come about by a political decision that he made to offer the referendum in the first place. But he will urge calm, he will urge stability, and I'm sure that he will be doing everything in his power to try to convey a sense of calm. The second call that I understand he will make is for the Tory party to come together, to urge his colleagues who have been so bitterly divided in this very bruising fight during the referendum to come together, basically not to start knocking lumps out of each other. The big question mark is whether or not he will address the matter of his own departure. Now, senior Tories I've been talking to in the last hour or so have actually, in the main, been pretty clear. They do not think this is the moment for David Cameron suddenly to say he's up and off. At a moment like this, when so much is up in the air, most people in the Tory party seem to be of the belief that he should stay, at least for the moment. But don't think that that doesn't mean there aren't conversations going on about this. And as we've discussed before, I think just the very experience of such a snub for him, the man who was front and centre of this campaign, who's been defeated in such a way, inevitably means in one way or another, his time in office is foreshortened. That doesn't mean he's about to come out of the door and resign, not at all. But But I do think whether he's publicly admitting it or not, privately, most people now in Westminster would say this morning that his time in office is certainly contracted. But in terms of actually seeing him, the only person who's come out of the door so far this morning, not actually a person, but Larry the cat. He'd never be one to miss a big moment like this.
And do you think he might, perhaps, while not, of course, coming out and saying I resign, which would cause even more chaos, do you think he might give an indication that perhaps come the autumn, you know, that he would act as a caretaker, but somebody else should take forward Britain's leaving the EU? Because quite clearly a lot of people would think it was kind of almost fraudulent for him to negotiate the departure when he's fought for this, you know, he's fought this bitter battle to stay in. Is he the man to take us out? Is he the man? Is he the man to get the best deal taking us out? When one of the reasons we lost is because people said the deal he got wasn't good enough.
Well, indeed, and also having, with such regularity and such forcefulness, sort of predicted doom and disaster if the public made this democratic decision. I think there are two different things there. Firstly, I think it is likely that there will be, maybe not explicitly, but some hint about the possible timetable. Perhaps he might say that at the party's conference in the autumn, he might set out his own future. Perhaps he might, at least privately, give his cabinet ministers some hint later today. We expect the cabinet will probably be brought together about what his own individual plans are.
Yes.
I think it's probably more likely that he will focus on appointing a negotiating team. It may be that he comes out and names one or two of the people who would be negotiating on the other side. Huge speculation about Michael Gove being part of the negotiating team, perhaps Boris Johnson too. It may be just that we get an assurance from David Cameron that people who won the argument will be part of those negotiations. But in terms of his own planned departure, whether it's 1 week, 1 month, 6 months, 1 year, I'm not sure how explicit he's going to be about that.
Okay.
And several senior Tories this morning who've been on the other side of the argument, just briefly, have said the first thing that he must do after calling for calm is to get a group of senior people together to make a plan before he can make any really detailed proposals.
Laura, let's just turn to the Labour Party, the other side of this whole argument. You may have picked up Tim Farron leading a rather small Liberal Democrat party in the House of Commons saying that Jeremy Corbyn failed to deliver. And certainly there's been a feeling that we've heard, you know, picked up a bit, that somehow Labour didn't bring out its own people in support of Remain quite as powerfully, as strongly, or with as much conviction as it should have done. What's going on in the Labour Party? Are there recriminations from people like Chuka Umunna, for instance, who was here earlier, talking about Labour's role?
I think undeniably there will be very serious recriminations. And on the Labour side, I've been already hearing from Labour people this morning who are angry and feel very much that Jeremy Corbyn did not do enough to mobilise the party, to mobilise that huge new membership that he managed to attract to the Labour Party over the summer, to get out the vote, and that what he described himself as a Remain and reform agenda was not the kind of thing that he was going to motivate people. He said, you know, the EU was 7 out of 10, 7.5 out of 10. Now, for many people, that was probably a very honest assessment. But as a rallying cry to get voters to turn out on an issue like this, certainly many Labour MPs feel that he just was not convincing enough. Somehow he had to be pushed and dragged into getting out there and making the case. What's also really irritating some Labour MPs this morning is that they've been sent round the script, the lines to take as it's called. A copy of that has been leaked to me, and in it the party headquarters is suggesting that they should tell the public that Jeremy Corbyn is now the only political leader who can unite the country, and in fact, as a critical Remainer, he is more in touch with the public than any of the other party leaders were. Now, given that much of this vote, not all of it, but much of this vote was about people showing they're unhappy about levels of European immigration, and that Jeremy Corbyn is probably the most pro-EU immigration leader out there at the moment, some Labour MPs think that, frankly, that beggars belief. And only one MP, I should say, but one MP predicted that there could also be a Labour leadership contest underway in the next couple of months.
Laura, thanks very much. Diane Abbott, just briefly, I mean, have you received a message from Labour Party headquarters, from Seamus Milne or somebody, that this is the line you should take?
I'm not one that responds to lines to take. I haven't done it for 30 years. I'm not going to start now.
It's a coincidence that you were saying exactly that a moment ago, then, Diane.
People that are complaining about Jeremy would blame Jeremy when the sun sets at night. The truth is, all fingers have to point at David Cameron. He chose to have this referendum. He chose the timing of it. He cooks up this totally bogus renegotiation, and he failed to persuade people.
But so did Labour fail to persuade people.
We, I think, got out more of our vote than he did of his.
Well, that we shall discover. That may well be true, but we shan't know for a bit. Kamal Ahmed, just come back to the economy now and to the problems that Britain's facing at this moment. 7:20 in the morning, markets all volatile, pound falling. What's going on?
It's been a remarkable night. If you think back to 10 o'clock, David, when we started this evening last night, the pound was hitting record highs for 2016, when the polls seemed to suggest that Remain had had a good day in the referendum. It has now sunk more quickly than it sank in the 2008 financial crisis. In Black Wednesday, when the pound was ejected from the exchange rate mechanism, markets are clearly signalling that the uncertainty created by the decision in the referendum has affected their appetite for risk, for investing in the UK to an extent.
Can I just ask you one thing? You say, you know, when we started at 10 o'clock last night, the opposite was happening. Don't people listening to this view all these markets with a certain contempt? That they just, because, you know, like gamblers, they see what they think's going to happen. The market rises, the pound rises. It doesn't happen, the pound falls. That's not real life.
Well, it has an effect on real life.
What's going to happen?
If your business is buying products in dollars and suddenly the pound has reduced in value against the dollar by over 10%, your business is starting to struggle. If you're an exporter to other markets and the pound falls, your exports become cheaper. Your business does better. So these are real things, and this is a real signal about investor confidence in sterling and, by association, in the UK economy, and if the UK economy is going to be positive in the future.
Right. Well, you remember Harold Wilson's remark about the pound in your pocket has not been devalued. If you go to the shops today or next week to do the weekly shop, are you going to find it more expensive because of what's happened in the markets today and because of the decision to pull out of the EU?
Well, it depends. So if sterling is lower in value, you tend to import inflation into the country because your imports become more expensive, and that does lead to more expensive prices in the shops if those are the kind of things you are buying.
I'm going to stop you for a second because Jenny Watson, the Chief Counting Officer, Chair of the Electoral Commission, is just announcing the final figures of this referendum.
The UK's membership of the European Union, held on the 23rd of June 2016. I hereby give notice that I have certified the following. The total number of ballot papers counted was 33,577,342. The total number of votes cast in favour of Remain was 16,141,241. The total number of votes cast in favour of Leave was 17,410,742. The number of ballot papers rejected was as follows. No official mark, 232. Both.
Good. I was just saying goodbye to Daniel Hannan, who's leaving, and you're off? New people coming in. OK. So let's just go back to where we were. The Bank of England, what's happening there?
So the Bank of England has just come out with a statement saying that it has undertaken extensive contingency planning and says it's working closely with the Treasury. I think I'm hearing from my banking sources that certainly banks do not want David Cameron to spark this Article 50 provision immediately to begin the process of Britain leaving the European Union. That would be a 2-year process. Banks I'm speaking to are saying if he does that immediately, they would have to immediately start relocation plans because a lot of banks only operate across Europe because of the way the single market functions. And if we leave that market, they may have to move some of their activities and their work into the euro area. So they want David Cameron to pause. They've asked for calm and they've asked for some calm, yeah.
Let's just listen to Nigel Farage speaking outside the House of Commons.
United Kingdom. And just look at it. Even the weather's improved. It's been a hell of a long journey, this. I first got involved in Eurosceptic politics 25 years ago, and the first election I contested, I managed to beat the late, great, screaming Lord Such by 164 votes, so I didn't come last. And now there are 17 million people that voted for Brexit. It's a victory for ordinary people, decent people. It's a victory against the big merchant banks, against the big businesses, and against big politics. And I'm proud of everybody that had the courage, in the face of all the threats, everything they were told, they had the guts to stand up and do the right thing. The election was won, in my view, in the Midlands and the North, and I think it was the old Labour vote that came to us, and we, particularly as a party, campaigned as hard as we could in those areas. There is still a massive disconnect between Westminster, SW1 and real communities. And the one image I will remember throughout the rest of my life was a woman in Bolton grabbing my hands with tears in her eyes saying, why doesn't David Cameron, why doesn't the government come and see what they've done to my community, what they've done to the prospects for my kids? People here don't understand. They're too wealthy. They don't get what open door mass immigration as a result of EU membership has done to people's wages, to people's availability of getting GP appointments or their kids into local schools. This was the issue ultimately that won this election. So I'm thrilled that we've done this. I believe the other big effect of this election is not what's happened in Britain, but what will happen in the rest of Europe. I mean, in the rest of the EU, Eurosceptic parties never talked about leaving the EU, now they are. An opinion poll in the Netherlands said that a majority there now want to leave. So we may well be close, perhaps, to Nexit. And similarly in Denmark, a majority there are in favour of leaving, so we could be quite close to Dexit. And I'm told the same may apply to Sweden and perhaps Austria and perhaps even Italy too. The EU's failing, the EU's dying. I hope we've knocked the first brick out of the wall. I hope this is the first step towards a Europe of sovereign nation states, trading together, neighbours together, friends together, but without flags, anthems, or useless old unelected presidents. So what happens now? What happens next? Well, 17 million people have said we must leave the European Union. We now need a Brexit government. A government that gets on with the job. A government that begins the renegotiation of our trade relationship. A government that'll be mindful that already many of the German car manufacturing unions have said, let's get on and do a deal. Let's go on buying, selling motor cars and wine and cheese with each other. But a government also that at the same time uses the opportunity of Brexit. And the opportunity is we're now freed to start making our own trade deals and associations with the rest of the world. We've left behind, with this result, we've left behind a failing political union. We've given ourselves the chance to rejoin the world in a 21st century global economy. So we need, as I say, a Brexit government. We need the negotiations to start as soon as humanly possible. We need to start thinking globally about our future. And the other thing I think that needs to happen is that June the 23rd needs to become a national bank holiday, and we will call it Independence Day.
Nigel Farage, who has now made, by my reckoning, 3 speeches since 4 o'clock this morning. In fact, when he sees a camera, he makes another speech, and no doubt he'll be making more. Though, of course, he wasn't part of the official Leave campaign, interestingly, and he's not in the House of Commons, and there are many people who thought his style of campaigning wasn't helpful. I don't know whether Kate Hoey, who's with me here, was among them, but there's the shot, early morning light, or it's not maybe longer, 7:30 in the morning in June is not early morning, is it? Boats moving up and down the Thames and the House of Commons there, and all those cameras out on the green. We've had a statement from the Bank of England. Let's just see that. The Bank of England will take all necessary steps to meet its responsibilities for monetary and financial stability. Well, I could have written that. No surprise. OK, now, I'm joined here by Kate Hoey, Labour MP for Vauxhall, who is a Leave campaigner, and Sir Eric Pickles, who ain't a Leave campaigner. But, Kate Hoey, you heard what Nigel Farage was saying. Decent, ordinary people have won. So decent, ordinary people are on the side of Leave and the others not decent and not ordinary and are just the toffs and the experts. Is that how you see it?
No, I think what I did see when I was going around the country a lot, and particularly in Labour areas, was this feeling that Labour voters really felt they hadn't been listened to, they weren't being listened to, and they had been ignored, they'd been called stupid, and they'd been called ignorant, they'd been called racist for really actually just saying what they thought was wrong.
I'll interrupt you. I'll come back to you now because Jeremy Corbyn has just joined us.
I have to watch
the
my
leader of their party. Mr. Corbyn, thank you very much for coming here.
Good morning.
Good morning. You famously said during this campaign you were 7.5 out of 10 in favour of remaining. Now you're 2.5. The 2.5 side of your intellect has won, and the 7.5 has been abandoned. How do you see the future now? Are you an enthusiastic Brexiter now?
Well, the British people have made their decision. We must respect that result, and Article 50 has to be invoked now so that we negotiate an exit from the European Union. I think a lot of the message that's come back from this is that many communities are fed up with cuts they've had, fed up with economic dislocation, and feel very angry at the way they've been betrayed and marginalised by successive governments in very poor areas of the country. And my point throughout the campaign was that we had to have an alternative to austerity. We had to have greater resources going into areas where there's been huge changes, and I strongly called for the introduction of a migrant impact fund as well as proper funding of local authorities. The results obviously are different across the country, different between densely populated urban areas and other parts of the country. We now have to try and protect the working conditions that we have in this country, and in the negotiations with the European Union try to obviously ensure there are some trade opportunities for Britain, because clearly there are some very difficult days ahead. The value of the pound has already fallen, and there will therefore be job consequences as a result of this decision.
But
we have to do everything we can to try and protect jobs and working conditions in Britain.
If you want to do everything you can to protect jobs and working conditions, why do you want an abrupt Article 50, i.e. we give you 2 years to get out, rather than what Daniel Hannan here a moment ago was suggesting, which was take it easy, go and talk to them in Europe, think about it, discuss it here, work out a strategy, and gently, gently you'll do much better than rushing headlong into Article 50.
Obviously there has to be a strategy, but the whole point of the referendum was that the public would be asked their opinion. They've given their opinion, and I think it's up to Parliament to now act upon that opinion. But quite clearly, negotiations must take place. There must be the best deal possible in order to ensure strong industries in Britain remain strong, and strong industries that have big export markets retain those export markets as far as we can. But we are in some very difficult areas. That's very obvious to everybody.
The accusation that Labour was half-hearted, and you in particular were rather half-hearted, with your 7.5, I don't know what you mean by that, 7.5 out of 10 support for the EU. Do you think you could have won this thing if you had been 10 out of 10 for remaining in the EU?
The point I made throughout the campaign, the point the Labour Party made throughout the campaign was there were many people who were not particularly happy with the European Union. The point I was making was there were good things that had come from Europe in working conditions and environmental protections, but there were other issues that had not been addressed properly, particularly economic inequalities in Britain. And therefore, I said that my project was that we should vote to remain in order to change and reform the European Union and put forward an economic strategy which isn't austerity, isn't punishing the poorest, which is actually trying to ensure that everyone gets a fair crack of the whip.
What about immigration? Because you clearly laid out your view of immigration, which was there was no upper limit to immigration into this country. Many of the people who support you, I suspect, but who voted to leave, believe there should be an upper limit. And you were very clear. I remember seeing you say it to Andrew Marr, no upper limit.
What I was clear about
was that a mistake?
What I was clear about was that within the single market in the European Union, there has to be free movement of people, and that we should also recognise that more than 1 million British people live in other parts of Europe, and indeed probably almost another 1 million work at various times in other parts of Europe. And so if we remain in the single market, then quite clearly free movement takes place. But the very strong point I was making was that there had to be an end to the undercutting of wages, there had to be an end to the destroying of working conditions in this country by people being brought in by unscrupulous employers. The point I was making was that nobody should be exploited, and we should face that down through the Posting of Workers Directive.
If we no longer have an obligation to take anybody who wishes to come here from the European Union to work, what would your policy, Labour's policy, be on immigration?
Well, at the moment there is controlled immigration from the rest of the world. There are often great difficulties over family reunion. There are people that come in with particular skill sets and particular jobs. We will obviously have to develop an immigration policy which will be applying to Europe as well as to the rest of the world. But I think we should also recognise that those that have migrated to this country have made an enormous contribution to our society. Indeed, there are 50,000 odd people from other parts of Europe working in our National Health Service, and so it is an important issue, and we have to recognise the skill sets that many have brought to this country and given us often a very good standard of living.
But do you, that's interesting, but do you accept that one of the reasons people voted to leave was because they thought immigration was too high? Whether they were right or wrong about that, in your view, they did think that.
Many probably did, but there's also the question of the impact of migration and the lack of government support for areas that have been most affected. So many of the poorest communities in Britain have had the biggest cuts in central government expenditure to support their local authorities, and at the same time been refused any special help to deal with issues of school places and health places, which are often actually quite temporary issues, but nevertheless very important that central government recognises those needs.
You make an elegant description about the problems that are there, but do you think you just missed a trick here, which was that people were much more worried about actual numerical immigration than you gave them credit for? You always said, oh, well, it would be all right if there were more housing. It would be all right if we stopped people being sent on lower wages, all the Posted Workers Directive and all that sort of stuff. Actually, it was the numbers people were worried about.
Well, I made those points because that is what I believe to be the right way forward, to end the exploitation of people, whoever they are, and ensure that our local authorities are properly funded in all parts of this country. This government has a strategy of systematically and quite deliberately underfunding all local authorities in the very poorest areas of this country that face the greatest problems.
Mr. Corbyn, what would you like to see the Prime Minister do now? Do you think there should be an election quite soon, say in the autumn, because we've had a Prime Minister who urged us to remain and the country decided to leave and it needs new policies?
The Prime Minister has some very urgent tasks ahead of him straight away, one of which is to try to stabilise the value of the pound. The other is to try and ensure the continuation of long-term investment in manufacturing and other industries, and then to begin the negotiations on the trade arrangements that are with the European Union. More than half our exports already go to the European Union. Thousands of companies all over the country rely on trade with the European Union. That relationship with the European Union after exit is absolutely crucial to the economic future of this country, and I hope the Prime Minister is going to be concentrating very urgently on that. What he does in the longer term is a matter for him to decide what he wants to do and what the Conservative Party wants to do. Our position is that we will oppose any urgent budget that causes great cuts and further austerity on people. We will support spending more resources in the areas hardest hit by both the recession and changes, and that we will try to get ready for a society where there is a greater degree of fairness and equality, and obviously effective and efficient trading relationships with the rest of the world.
And in the meantime, in the national interest, you want Prime Minister and Chancellor of the Exchequer to stay in place?
I want them to decide now, quickly, what they're going to do to try and stabilise the value of the pound. And then they will no doubt be making a statement to the House on Monday. The important thing is to try to protect jobs at the present time. Those jobs are partly dependent on the value of the currency and obviously the export markets that are available.
Mr. Corbyn, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
So, at this point, let's have a full catch-up with the news. Here's Louise Minchin.
Thank you, David. Good morning. Britain has voted to leave the European Union. The result was officially declared in the past half an hour. There have been strong wins for leave in North East England and in the Midlands. Scotland and Northern Ireland voted to remain in the EU. The UKIP leader and Leave campaigner Nigel Farage said immigration was the key issue.
People here don't understand. They're too wealthy. They don't get what open door mass immigration as a result of EU membership has done to people's wages, to people's availability of getting GP appointments or their kids into local schools. This was the issue ultimately that won this election. So I'm thrilled that we've done this. I believe the other big effect of this election is not what's happened in Britain, but what will happen in the rest of Europe.
The Labour MP Chuka Umunna, who campaigned for a Remain vote, says the result has exposed divisions within Britain.
This is a big thing for our country. And what this has exposed is a lot of division, and there's a lot of talk as if this is an overwhelming win. It isn't. There's 48% of people on the current projection who did not vote for this. Now, the challenge for people in this context is how to lead and bring our country together.
So, hello again. Now, I've been joined, you may have seen them before, by Sir Eric Pickles, newly, I was going to say ennobled, knighted, and Kate Hoey, the Labour MP, who was in favour of leaving. Sir Eric, you kick off on this. What do you make of this result? Are you dismayed by what's happened?
I'm sad, I'm dismayed, but that's democracy. So we've now just got to get on with it, and we need to get on with it with a reasonable degree of speed. We need to ensure that our economy is stable. We then need to start the negotiation process, and we actually start the negotiation process with people outside the European community that previously would relied on the European community to do. And of course, then we're going to have to decide exactly the mix that we currently relied on the European Union to fund. And we're going to have to decide whether that mixture of economic development and on farming is the right one in competition with things like the national
But look here, we were threatened with fire and brimstone by the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer. You were saying none of that's going to actually happen. That was all just fantasy land.
I'm not saying anything close to that. I'm rather hoping that that situation doesn't arise. And that's going to mean that the government's going to have to move fairly quickly to establish what our economy is going to look like when we leave. And in particular, given that I think it's 80% of our economy relies on the service industries, we're going to have to kind of know where they are going to be. Are we going to suddenly see a great flight of firms, which I hope is not going to be the case, to say Frankfurt, in order for them to be able to trade inside the European community? I'm looking for us to try and find a Brexit that leaves our relationship with the European community on as friendliest terms as is possible.
But, I mean, the interesting point about that is that some people said the exaggerations, which clearly you are now saying, well, you're not saying they were because you didn't say that, and I wouldn't put words into your mouth. But the things that they said would happen, which you are now talking about not happening, were the things that put people off the campaign, and they thought, that's absolute rubbish, you're not going to take any account of that.
If that's what you think I've said, then I have misspoke. What we want to do is to try and avoid the worst-case scenario that was carefully outlined during the campaign, and that's going to require an enormous amount of skill to do that.
Kate, I'll come to you, but we're just joined by Philip Hammond, the Foreign Secretary. Mr. Hammond, good morning. Thank you for joining us from College Green. What is your reaction to this news? We've been hearing a lot from abroad about the alarm and despondency that it's caused among our allies and all that. What's your role now? What are you going to do now that Britain is leaving the EU?
Well, look, first thing the government's got to do is immediately seeking to stabilise the situation in the markets, and then moving to begin a process of negotiating the very best possible terms we can get for Britain to leave the European Union, leaving in place as much as we possibly can of our trading relationships and our economic relationships, including the very important role that the City of London plays in Europe's financial economy. And that will be the big challenge of the coming months, I think.
One of the arguments that was raised by the Prime Minister, he was somewhat criticised for it, was that our security depended upon being in the EU. You remember him talking about the white gravestones of the First and Second World Wars. He didn't say there'd be a Third World War, but he said it would be a more dangerous world with Britain outside the EU. You're the Foreign Secretary. Do you think it's now a more dangerous world?
Look, I don't want to overstate the case, but I do think that Britain has been a very positive influence inside the European Union on the security agenda. I think, for example, that in responding to Russia's aggression in Ukraine through European Union sanctions and keeping the European Union united behind those sanctions with a clear and robust position against what Mr. Putin is doing has been largely due to Britain's influence. And I do worry that with Britain now having a hugely diminished voice in this debate, we will see that resolve among our European partners wavering.
Is NATO not sufficient protection against Russia and Putin?
Look, NATO is our main bulwark against any attack on us, of course, and NATO will remain our principal defence mechanism, and that protects us against any attack. What we were doing with economic sanctions was dealing with a situation where we were not directly threatened. Look, nobody in Western Europe was going to go to war over Ukraine, but we did want to signal our very strong distaste for what the Russians were doing, and to signal to the Russians that that course of action would have costs for them. And economic sanctions proved to be quite an effective tool. It worked in Iran, forcing the Iranians to abandon their nuclear weapons program, and it's piling the pressure on Mr. Putin. But I suspect this morning he will be feeling a little bit less pressure, and he'll be feeling a little bit more upbeat about his prospects of eventually getting these European Union sanctions watered down.
Well, given how strongly you feel about it, can you not devise a way of remaining part of that?
Well, that's what we've now got to do, isn't it? Talk to our former partners in the European Union about a way forward in the future. Clearly, that's got to focus mainly on the trading relationship, because that is the thing that is most important to Britain's future prosperity and well-being, but also looking at ways in which we can continue to collaborate with European Union partners, many of whom are NATO members, so we do have a platform here on other issues in the future. But let's look at the EU sanctions on Russia question as a sort of bellwether. We've pretty much agreed that they will be rolled over in June, but the question is maintaining the robustness of the sanctions regime going forward after June, and Britain's voice in that debate has been a very, very important one over the last 18 months.
Well, we'll probably still be members of the EU in June, because it can't be yes, unscrambled that quickly.
Yeah, I mean, we are rolling the sanctions over now,
yes.
and we will remain members of the European Union probably for at least the next 2 years. But look, nobody can imagine that our voice in the European Union will carry weight as of today. We will not be, in effect, a party to those decisions which the European Union is making. Our relationship with the European Union as of 6 o'clock this morning changed fundamentally. It is now one of a semi-outsider negotiating future arrangements. We simply can't expect to have a voice that carries the full weight of the second largest member state, as we had last week.
Were you surprised by the result?
I was surprised by the result, but you know, I won't be the first
politician in history that's misread what's going on an election day or a referendum day. We've always been clear that we would accept the decision of the British people and we would deliver the instructions that they gave the government. And our job now is to calm the situation, stabilise the markets, reunite the country, and then let's move forward to deliver the very best outcome we possibly can. Honestly, I believe that outcome, economically in particular, will not be as good as it would have been if we'd remained in the European Union. But our job collectively is to make sure it is as good as it possibly can be in the circumstances, that we get the very best deal we possibly can with the European Union for Britain going forward.
Philip Hammond, thank you very much for joining us. Jeremy.
A look, David, at comparisons with 1975, the first referendum on being a member of the European Union. So we're in our virtual Queen Elizabeth Tower at Westminster. You can see the clock, I think, showing the right time from the inside. Let me just show you the 75 result here in England. So you can see the level of Euroscepticism, the Leave vote, just above 30% in 1975. And this is very dramatic now. Have a look at what happens when I bring in the 2016 result. So it goes above 50%, a majority, quite some majority in England against being part of the EU. A bigger majority than across the whole of the UK as an average. We'll compare the other parts of this nation now. So we go to Wales, and Wales in 1975, Eurosceptic vote about 35%. Let's see what happened last night. And it goes up again into a majority position, about 53%. So Wales and England, both quite a bit more doubtful about the EU than they were 40 years ago. But a different story in Northern Ireland. So let's bring this one round here and have a look at Northern Ireland. 1975, more Eurosceptic than either Wales or England, as it happens, nearly 50%. But now, let's see, less so. So becoming a bit more accustomed to the EU, just as we're pulling out. And Scotland, you know what's coming here, 1975 result, our final clock face, we go back in time, 41% wanting out of the EU in 1975. And in the last 24 hours, how many decided the same? Down to about 37%. So it's a divided nation, this. Scotland wants to stay in. England is effectively, along with Wales, pulling Scotland out. It's a very interesting situation where Northern Ireland and Scotland have become less Eurosceptic in the last 40 years. And David, England and Wales more so.
Jeremy, thank you very much. Well, we're waiting to hear sometime, we think, after 8 o'clock from the Prime Minister at 10 Downing Street. We don't know what he's going to say. We were speculating whether he'd give a hint that he might be leaving office, maybe in the autumn, or that he was going to carry on and do these negotiations. But we shall stick with it, and we shall be there. Laura Kunsberg is down there. But Kate Hoey, I've spoken to her twice, and each time she's been cut off, once by the Foreign Secretary, once by the leader of her own party.
Oh, I've got to be cut off by the leader of my own party.
You better be cut off by a leader. So, Sadiq Khan, Mayor of London, said Project Hate was what you were on about during this campaign, and that it was a very unpleasant, nasty campaign. I mean, he attacked Boris Johnson, but he might just as well have been attacking you.
Well, no, I don't think so, because, well, I hope he wouldn't be, because I mean, I made criticisms of campaigns on both sides, but, you know, I think it has been very difficult for people to talk about immigration in a rational, fair way without being accused of being some kind of, you know, closet racist. And I think that has really hurt a lot of people right across the country who felt that they haven't been listened to, as I said before. And so I don't think, you know, I think where the Labour Party has failed over many years is to see that that is something that really matters to people, and that it's not being anti-immigration to be able to talk rationally about how do you control numbers of people coming into the country. Because no matter how many resources go into things that Jeremy's talked about, we need to know, and we need to also, I believe, get rid of the discrimination against people from outside the EU, which is very, very apparent in all those countries, ex-Commonwealth countries, parts of Africa, Asia, where it's so difficult for someone to come in, and yet you can walk in unchallenged from any of those 26
But
other countries.
how could Labour have talked about this without simply saying it wanted to leave the EU? Because it's axiomatic, it's a rule of the EU that people, like the Poles, 1 million of whom live in this country and work away, that they can do that. So the only way they could ever have done that is by saying we want to leave the EU.
And of course, that's what the Labour Party was, a EU sceptic party. That changed because there was this terrible worry about what was going to happen under Mrs. Thatcher in terms of rights at work and so on. But, everything that we've got in terms of our rights at work and maternity benefits and all of those things are enshrined in British law. And, the scaremongering that went on about how we would lose those if we were to leave, people will be waking up this morning and some people will actually think they've suddenly got no benefits anymore, maternity rights, so on. And I think that the sort of Project Fear was actually completely ignored by huge numbers of people, particularly out of London. Once you got out of London, and I was around a lot out of London, it was just so different. And people at the leadership of all the parties did not seem to be listening to that it was a very different scene outside London. And I did some rallies last week up in the northeast, and it was so obvious that people were not going to follow the leader of the party's view, even though I genuinely believe that the leader of my party I don't think he's desperately unhappy today.
Why could you only persuade 10 of your fellow MPs?
I think it was 15 in the end, David.
Oh, was it?
Yes, 15.
Turncoats?
Well, no, I've always said we were a minority in Parliament.
Why?
But I represent, Frank Field represents Gisela Stewart, who's done a magnificent job, John Mann, all these people, Kelvin Hopkins, we represent now 45% of Labour voters in the country. And the party was very, very silly not to allow a much more free view on this and the idea that somehow they were just going to, say you must vote Labour, because you vote Labour in the past, you must vote for the EU. It just was never going to work. And so I don't feel any...
So you say nearly half Labour voters were with you in voting
Labour
to leave.
supporters. I think you will find that all the polls we did and said even a month ago that we had 35 to 45% of Labour supporters. And also people, the thing that most concerns me is the people we've lost over the last few years. We're going to find that very difficult to get those people back now because they've been ignored again by the Labour leadership.
We just have a quote come in from the President of the European Council, Donald Tusk. This is not a moment for hysterical reactions. Oh. On behalf of the 27 leaders today, I can say we're determined to keep our unity as 27. In other words, don't all start thinking you can leave just because Britain's leaving.
I think we will see. We've been in touch with some of the campaigns in other countries who've been over. I think we'll see a lot of referendums now coming in other EU countries.
France?
Yes. I think probably Holland first.
Holland.
And
on the same lines, should we stay or leave?
I think it will be that, yes, in one or two of the other, unless the EU and the unelected commissioners see this as a real catalyst to actually start to change the way they work. And I don't think reform is possible. That was my only difference with Jeremy Corbyn, because he believes it's a neoliberal organisation that's dysfunctional, but he thinks it could still be reformed. I don't.
At that point, we'll have the news again, and the weather, of course, all important after yesterday's ghastly rainstorms all over Britain. Here's Louise Minchin.
Thank you, David. Good morning. Britain is to leave the European Union. The official result of the referendum was announced in the past hour. North Eastern England and the Midlands voted strongly to leave, but the Remain campaign won a majority in Scotland and Northern Ireland. Our political correspondent Eleanor Garnier reports on a dramatic night.
Well, at 20 minutes to 5, we can now say the decision taken in 1975 by this country to join the common market has been reversed by this referendum to leave the EU. We are absolutely clear now that there is no way that the Remain side can win. It looks
Watch and listen carefully. This is history in the making.
The British people have spoken, and the answer is we're out.
And in the last hour, the official result.
The total number of votes cast in favour of leave was 17,410,742.
A final tally of 52 to 48%.
It's unbelievable, isn't it? Change the face of Europe!
UKIP celebrated overnight. By daylight, things were sinking in.
Good morning, everybody. The sun has risen on an independent, united kingdom. And just look at it, even the weather's improved.
As Leave campaigners celebrated, on the other side, the blame game started.
I absolutely accuse Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour leadership of utter spinelessness in not getting involved in this campaign for Britain's very soul and very future.
The Labour leader said he accepted the British people's decision, adding that there was a clear message from the result.
Many communities are fed up with cuts they've had, fed up with economic dislocation, and feel very angry at the way they've been betrayed and marginalised by successive governments in very poor areas of the country.
And with the pound plunging, Remain campaigners warned of turmoil ahead.
This moment, this is a seismic moment for our country that goes far beyond all the personalities. There's going to be a lot of chat what happens to David Cameron. This is a big thing for our country. And what this has exposed is a lot of division, and there's a lot of talk as if this is an overwhelming win. It isn't. There's 48% of people on the current projection who did not vote for this.
But this prominent Leave campaigner called for cross-party cooperation.
We have a responsibility, and that responsibility is to act in the best long-term interests of this country.
Voters will now reflect on their verdict, the instruction they've given to Westminster. But the magnitude of this moment may only become clear in the weeks and months ahead. Ellen Naganya, BBC News.
Well, hello again. We're going to be joined by somebody who's very important now for the Conservative Party in all these discussions that will be taking place. Graham Brady, who's the chairman of the powerful 1922 committee, he was in favour of Brexit, and he's got Brexit. Mr. Brady, first question, have you, as some people say, got 50 letters in your pocket or in your office, ready signed, wanting a leadership contest right away?
No, I can knock that on the head straight away. The procedures are very simple. They're set out in the constitution of the Conservative Party, and if that were to be the case, then I would have had to have communicated that to the Prime Minister already, and we would have begun a process for a confidence vote. So I can very clearly say, no, I haven't got 50 letters, and furthermore, my own personal view is that it's very important that David Cameron remains in post, remains in office, and continues to steer the course now that we have this very clear result from the people.
For how long?
Well, that's a matter for him. It's a matter
hang on. It's not a matter for him, it's a matter for you, because you are the party, and you can decide, as you've just said, with 50 letters
it's a matter for both. But I think the really important thing at the moment is that we have got a clear steer from the British public. They would like to restore the position where we can make our own laws, we can set our own taxes, we can control our own borders. We know what we have to do, but it is a difficult, complicated thing to achieve. It'll take a period of time, and I think it's very important that we have continuity, we have stability, and I think that David Cameron remaining in office is really crucial. We need to settle the markets over the coming days, and we need to move forward to a credible plan for implementing the will of the people.
How easy will it be for him to, put it this way, eat humble pie, accept that he's lost, and then suddenly turn round and adopt the opinions of the other side?
Well, I think we have to remember that David Cameron delivered the referendum. It is implicit in holding a referendum of this sort that you have to accept the will of the people at the end of it. He made it clear before the referendum result was known that he would continue in office whatever the outcome. So I think it is obviously his intention. I think it's obviously the right thing for the country because we need that period of stability and continuity.
It's quite different though. I mean, the 75 referendum, which I had the great good fortune to cover, Harold Wilson didn't do that. Harold Wilson did sign the thing saying we'd like you to join the common market, but then he stood back and let his cabinet ministers fight it out. David Cameron has been right there in the front. He's been on the front foot. He gave a special press conference on the roof. He's been campaigning all the way through. So it's not quite the same as saying, I accept the verdict of the British people. It's more like fighting a general election and losing, isn't it?
Well, I think it would have been better had the Prime Minister remained above the fray through the campaign. He chose not to, but it was very clear throughout that whatever the outcome, he would remain Prime Minister. I think that what we've seen, of course, in this result at 52-48 is clear enough as it is. But I think there's something more important if you contrast this to the 1975 referendum, which is that the clear, overwhelming inclination of the British people was to be free from the political union of the EU. And I think it was really a matter for the vast majority of the public. Either they were enthusiastic Brexiters or they were reluctant Remainers.
Okay.
So both the people and, I have to say, the Conservative Party will be much more at ease with this result than we would have been with the other.
Graham Brady, thanks very much. Let's just go quickly down to Schroders and join Simon Jack, who has news about the start of trading. Simon, yes, you can wave to us and we can hear and see you. What's the news?
Jolly good, David, thanks. Yes, well, you can talk about the conjecture of the future. What's happening here and now is the FTSE 100. The stock market opened a few moments ago. It's down 500 points already. That's 8.5%. Hardly surprising after the record fall in sterling we saw overnight. Some of the big hitters, the ones getting really hit, they are house builders and banks. Barclays is down 35% this morning in early trading. Some of the house builders down 40%. There are fears that this could hit the property market, both the banks and the house builders would get hit. So some really, really severe poundings being taken by some of the shares. Down 500 points. It has found a level. Sterling has gone up a little bit since it fell 10% overnight, but some really big moves here. Financial shockwaves being felt right throughout the city.
Is it the kind of thing which will bounce back during the day or a couple of days' time, in your experience, Simon?
Well, I think with the banks, what will happen is that the Bank of England will come out and say, look, we stand ready to do this. We knew there might be some shockwaves if we got this result. So we're there to stand by them and make sure this doesn't turn into anything nastier. So I think the banks may bounce back. As for house builders, this will be a real knock to confidence. Whenever you think about the property market perhaps being affected, the banks and the house builders get hit first. So, yes, I mean, there's what they call a dead cat bounce. I think when you see losses of this magnitude, they do tend to bounce back in time. But I think that losses of that magnitude really do illustrate just how powerful the shockwaves are being felt here in the city. There was this nagging feeling going into the referendum. Who's got this right? Have the city got it right or have the polls got it right? Because the city was rather complacently, a pound was worth $1.50. It was riding high until midnight last night. And then it turned out the polls were right and the city was wrong. There was an almighty reckoning on sterling overnight when it fell twice as much as it did on Black Wednesday back in 1992. That is having its reverberations in markets in Asia. We saw them fall 8.5%. The FTSE 100 as a whole, which has lots of international companies, is down 8.5%. You go below that to the FTSE 250, which are UK-focused companies, that's down 12.5%. And the ones in the firing line for economic shocks, the banks, are down in some cases by 35%.
Simon, thank you very much indeed. Dead cat bounce, peculiarly horrible analogy at this time in the morning, but anyway. We join Laura Kunsberg, who's, again, outside number 10, and we're waiting for the Prime Minister to come. There's the stand just being put in place, meaning he's about to come out.
There Laura. That's right, David. The podium has just been put out, and I have to say this is not confirmed by any stretch, but there's a rumour going round this street that actually, when David Cameron comes out, he may be going to resign as Prime Minister after 6 years in office. Now, I must stress that is not by any stretch a confirmation at all, but just in the last few minutes, up and down the press pack here in this street, that suggestion is now being made. Now, of course, David Cameron, I understand his first priority will be urge stability in the wake of this tumultuous result. The result, of course, that means a very significant defeat for him, a very significant drain on his authority. Senior Tories have said privately and publicly that actually they do not believe that he has to go, but it sounds as if he has made that personal calculation that actually it might be the right thing for him to do that. But I must stress That is not confirmed by any stretch, but the suggestion, as these things often happen, the rumour swirls up and down Downing Street on a morning such as this of huge political import, that David Cameron may be about to announce that he is leaving office. But again, David, I hate to sound as if I'm adding all sorts of caveats, but we can't be clear about that
fair.
quite yet.
Fair enough. We'll hear from the horse's mouth, so to speak, in a moment. Anna Soubry's with us, the business minister. What do you think he's going to do? Do you think he should go? Do you think there should be...
I don't want him to go. I think he's... I mean, I voted for Ken. So I'm a late comer to the Cameroon camp.
Ken Clarke?
Yeah, in the election when we chose our leader.
Yeah.
And I think he's been an outstanding leader, Cameron. And I think he's been a great Prime Minister.
But this must be a devastating blow to him, isn't it, personally?
It's a devastating blow to our country. And I think there's a lot of people waking up this morning. And I include friends, because most of my friends are actually not politicians. I lead a fairly normal life. And I've spent a lot of time in the last few weeks on the streets. I know I'm an East Midlands girl through and through. I've seen stuff, I've heard stuff I've not heard since I was a student in Dalston back in the late 70s.
What kind of stuff?
People thinking that it's acceptable not only to shout traitor at you, but to stand and say, I'm voting out because I want these immigrants out. This is not a criticism of Kate Hoey, I make this clear, because I know Kate's a good woman and I know our views are exactly the same. But I think we have unleashed something, and I think I heard Chuka talking about the need now to repair, and he's right. I think that overlying tolerance of Britain has been removed from large sections, and if you look at the vote, I'm afraid it has to be said that there's been a large vote from white, working-class, Labour areas. They're not going to listen to a liberal Tory like me. And they voted in the face of the fact that they've probably never even seen a migrant. But it's the fault of politicians, because you can't for decades say that the EU's pretty rubbish and the root of many of our concerns, and say that migrant workers need controlling, as opposed to saying how much they contribute, and then say to people, oh, actually, guys, in 4.5 months' time, not only ignore what we've been telling you, not me, I've always been hugely in favour of us staying in the EU, and then say to people, not only do you accept the opposite to what we've been telling you, but actually positively go out and vote for it. We can't be surprised at this in many ways.
Prime Minister's coming out now
with
his wife beside him there, so that suggests a personal statement is going to come.
Just taken part in a giant democratic exercise, perhaps the biggest in our history. Over 33 million people from England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and Gibraltar have all had their say. We should be proud of the fact that in these islands we trust the people with these big decisions. We not only have a parliamentary democracy, but on questions about the arrangements for how we're governed, there are times when it is right to ask the people themselves, and that is what we have done. The British people have voted to leave the European Union, and their will must be respected. I want to thank everyone who took part in the campaign on my side of the argument, including all those who put aside party differences to speak in what they believed was the national interest. And let me congratulate all those who took part in the Leave campaign for the spirited and passionate case that they made. The will of the British people is an instruction that must be delivered. It was not a decision that was taken lightly, not least because so many things were said by so many different organisations about the significance of this decision. So there can be no doubt about the result. Across the world, people have been watching the choice that Britain has made. I would reassure those markets and investors that Britain's economy is fundamentally strong. And I would also reassure Brits living in European countries and European citizens living here that there will be no immediate changes in your circumstances. There will be no initial change in the way our people can travel, in the way our goods can move, or the way our services can be sold. We must now prepare for a negotiation with the European Union. This will need to involve the full engagement of the Scottish, Welsh and Northern Ireland governments to ensure that the interests of all parts of our United Kingdom are protected and advanced. But above all, this will require strong, determined and committed leadership. I'm very proud and very honoured to have been Prime Minister of this country for 6 years. I believe we've made great steps, with more people in work than ever before in our history, with reforms to welfare and education, increasing people's life chances, building a bigger and stronger society, keeping our promises to the poorest people in the world, and enabling those who love each other to get married, whatever their sexuality. But above all, restoring Britain's economic strength. And I'm grateful to everyone who's helped to make that happen. I've also always believed that we have to confront big decisions, not duck them. That is why we delivered the first coalition government in 70 years to bring our economy back from the brink. It's why we delivered a fair, legal, and decisive referendum in Scotland. And it's why I made the pledge to renegotiate Britain's position in the European Union and to hold a referendum on our membership, and have carried those things out. I fought this campaign in the only way I know how, which is to say directly and passionately what I think and feel, head, heart, and soul. I held nothing back. I was absolutely clear about my belief that Britain is stronger, safer, and better off inside the European Union. And I made clear the referendum was about this and this alone, not the future of any single politician, including myself. But the British people have made a very clear decision to take a different path. And as such, I think the country requires fresh leadership to take it in this direction. I will do everything I can as Prime Minister to steady the ship over the coming weeks and months. But I do not think it would be right for me to try to be the captain that steers our country to its next destination. This is not a decision I've taken lightly, but I do believe it's in the national interest to have a period of stability and then the new leadership required. There is no need for a precise timetable today, but in my view, we should aim to have a new Prime Minister in place by the start of the Conservative Party conference in October. Delivering stability will be important, and I will continue in post as Prime Minister with my Cabinet for the next 3 months. The Cabinet will meet on Monday. The Governor of the Bank of England is making a statement about the steps that the Bank and the Treasury are taking to reassure financial markets. We will also continue taking forward the important legislation that we set before Parliament in the Queen's speech. And I've spoken to Her Majesty the Queen this morning to advise her of the steps that I'm taking. A negotiation with the European Union will need to begin under a new Prime Minister. And I think it's right that this new Prime Minister takes the decision about when to trigger Article 50 and start the formal and legal process of leaving the EU. I will attend the European Council next week to explain the decision the British people have taken and my own decision. The British people have made a choice. That not only needs to be respected, but those on the losing side of the argument, myself included, should help to make it work. Britain is a special country. We have so many great advantages. A parliamentary democracy where we resolve great issues about our future through peaceful debate. A great trading nation with our science and arts, our engineering and our creativity respected the world over. And while we are not perfect, I do believe we can be a model of a multiracial, multi-faith democracy where people can come and make a contribution and rise to the very highest that their talent allows. Although leaving Europe was not the path I recommended, I am the first to praise our incredible strengths. I've said before that Britain can survive outside the European Union, and indeed that we could find a way. Now the decision has been made to leave, we need to find the best way. And I will do everything I can to help. I love this country, and I feel honoured to have served it. And I will do everything I can in future to help this great country succeed. Thank you very much.
Prime Minister with Samantha, his voice breaking as he said those last words, announcing that he was going to stand down and they needed a new leader, a new Prime Minister by October, and only then would negotiations, he seemed to say, under the new Prime Minister, begin with the EU. He said that he'd been head, heart and soul, held nothing back in his belief that Britain was safer inside the EU, but it wasn't the future of the politicians that was at stake. And the country had decided what they had decided, and he would go along with it. So the Prime Minister has, in effect, stood down, but not for another 3 months until the Conservative Party conference. How those 3 months will be spent, I don't know. Anna Soubry, what's your immediate reaction to what you've heard?
I think it's terrible.
Terrible?
Terribly sad. I mean, I think, truthfully, he had no alternative. And I just hope he'll be remembered. You know, here he was. This is a true body blow, because he led from the front, and he comes out, and he's shown as ever this beautiful composure, this remarkable leadership, this great courage to admit, look, you know, I put my neck on the line, and here we are. But his testimony will be, as he said, you know, same-sex marriage, trying to do the best for poor people at home and abroad. He's been a remarkable Prime Minister, and I hope that this won't cloud our memory of him.
Laura Kunsberg from Downing Street. We're now then faced with a leadership battle between now and October, and according to the Prime Minister, before negotiations can begin with the EU, if I understood him rightly.
Yes. Yes, we certainly are. So 3 very big headlines in there. Of course, the first, that the Prime Minister has decided that he has really no option but to walk out of Downing Street, to leave this place where he's been in charge for the last 6 years. The ultimate irony, of course, that the younger, fresh-faced Tory leader who years ago told his party to stop banging on about Europe made a decision to hold a referendum to bang on about Europe himself, which has ultimately cost him his job. His closest colleagues have always called him a lucky politician, but on this ultimate gamble, well, his luck has dramatically run out. But as you say, he was very clear, and it appears this was part of his decision, that triggering Article 50, the beginning of those vital negotiations with other countries in the EU, should be done under a new Prime Minister, under new leadership, and that, in his view, cannot therefore start until the Tory party conference in October. So Article 50 will not be triggered immediately. And I have to say, really, this morning he's saying 2 things that are the polar opposite of what he said repeatedly in the campaign. He repeatedly said he wouldn't have to resign if he lost the vote, and he repeatedly said that as Prime Minister he would trigger that Article 50, those vital negotiations, immediately. On both of those 2 things, after the result overnight, his calculations have completely changed.
How effective can he be? There'll be a battle going on within the Tory party over who's to succeed him. How effective can he be at doing what he described as everything to steady the ship? I'm going to steady the ship, but I'm not the captain to lead it to the next destination.
I think it's extremely difficult because authority is drained away from him really overnight, and it's going to be very difficult to see what kind of influence he can have now over whether it's domestic policy or handling those relations around the EU. You know, there's a European summit next week in Brussels. He said he was still going to go. He's going to go and explain his decision and probably have to explain this referendum result to the counterparts, those other European leaders with whom he's dealt for many years. But you're absolutely right. This means that for the Conservative Party, now their focus inevitably will move to who is going to succeed him. And frankly, the entire referendum campaign has been laced through with Tory leadership ambition in any case. You know, we've all talked incessantly, because it's been part of the story, about people's decisions, which campaign to go for. Did Boris Johnson jump for out because of his ambition? That's certainly part of the mix. What about Michael Gove, who's now become a very much better known figure in the Tory party because of his decision? It seems pretty clear to me that for people who are interested in the top job, we know who they are. Their focus now will not be our relations with the EU. They will be the Tory leadership battle, and battle will already have commenced. And I know that this morning there have been discussions among some of the people who fancy their chances about the best way forward already.
Just on that, and I want to ask you about the Chancellor of the Exchequer after this, but just on that point, if you've got candidates, Michael Gove, Boris Johnson, possibly Theresa May, will this process actually start soon? I mean, they have to have this vote among MPs and then take 2 candidates out to the Conservative Party in the country, don't they? When would you expect that all to happen?
Right. Well, I think probably pretty soon. I mean, the parliamentary term is due to run for another 4 weeks. That period will, for many Tory MPs, be all about whose names get on that final ballot. Very briefly, unlike the Labour Party, essentially, Tory MPs decide who from quite a wide field gets down to 2 places on the ballot paper. So Tory party members only have a choice between 2 candidates. So there will be now frantic wheeler dealing behind closed doors among the Conservative Parliamentary Party. And just think of this too, that the Tory party membership, which only numbers about 150,000 people, are going to choose our next Prime Minister. Now, there's all sorts of speculation, of course, this morning in Westminster about an early election because of what's happened, because of how this result has upended politics. That's got to be more likely if you think that the next Prime Minister will be chosen by a vote of 150,000 people. And particularly while Jeremy Corbyn is still in place in the Labour Party, who most Conservatives assume they would beat quite easily in an election, that is their view. There would, of course, be a temptation for whoever becomes the Tory leader, the next Prime Minister, to call for an early election. So not only overnight, and with this statement, do we have the prospect of a new Prime Minister, but an increasingly likely prospect of an early election too.
Gordon Brown, of course, was criticised for not calling an election after he became Prime Minister.
Absolutely.
Because people view the Prime Minister now as the elected person at an election, not as somebody who just, you know, you change them at will. So there would be pressure to have an early election, no doubt. But what about the Chancellor of the Exchequer? If we're talking about a steady ship, does it mean George Osborne stays in place for the time being?
I think for the time being, you would expect that. But as David Cameron has basically said, he'll be gone within 3 months. I think the widespread assumption would be that George Osborne would go at that point too. George Osborne, for a long time, has been seen as sort of really joined at the hip. Some people even call it the Camborne project. You know, George Osborne and David Cameron have been together step by step in the early days of their leadership, their joint leadership almost, when they were sort of young bucks who surprised everybody by taking over the Conservative Party when they were comparatively young. Of course, George Osborne was the youngest Chancellor for decades. But most people would now assume that as David Cameron has been defeated, as he has been snubbed, the public have overturned him really, that also applies to George Osborne, who's had a particularly bruising 6 months or so, a budget that unravelled. His own strategy through this campaign has been rubbished by very many Conservative MPs, with dozens of them going on the record to say that his position would be untenable if Brexit was to happen, which was essentially a coup in waiting. And I think further on from that, that means in this Tory leadership contest, George Osborne's chances are pretty slim. And frankly, he is a cunning politician. He will not run unless he thinks he's got a real chance of winning. So I think, as things feel this morning, it's pretty unlikely that his name would be on the ballot paper. And that is surprising, given for so long in Westminster, he was seen by a lot of people loyal to the government and the Tory party as very much the heir apparent.
Laura, thanks very much. So the news that the Prime Minister David Cameron has said he'll do everything to steady the ship for the time being, but that he's not the captain to take Britain to its next destination. And he believes that by October there should be a new leader. He's in effect triggered a leadership race. He's going to stand down. They need a new leader by October. He's told the Queen this, he said, and negotiations about a new Prime Minister will start. And he doesn't believe that the negotiations with the EU, that is the triggering of Article 50, which says, in effect, we want to leave, we have 2 years to discuss how we're going to do it. He doesn't believe that should happen right away, contrary to what he said during the campaign. He believes it should wait for the new Prime Minister to get in place. And then there's the whole argument about whether the new Prime Minister will feel he has the authority to do it without having a general election. So all that is for the future. Let's join Emily now, up there in the gallery. Emily.
It is the breathtaking speed with which these things happen. I'm joined by Isabel Hardman and Andrew Rawnsley, who've been with us at intervals throughout the night. And just to look at that image of Downing Street now deserted, the running on College Green towards who we're expecting, Boris.
And all the more extraordinary, Emily, if we think back just over a year, David Cameron was standing outside Number 10 celebrating a general election victory that most people, including himself, had not seen coming, and being the first Conservative leader to win a parliamentary majority for his party since 1992. Just slightly over a year later, he's having to announce his resignation. I think rightly so, because in the end, he picked this referendum. He dictated the timing. He was the chief advocate for the inside during the campaign. And it wasn't going to be credible in the end when he'd told the country, this decision is more important than a general election. Well, if you lose a general election, you have to walk out of number 10. So you lose a referendum, you're going to have to do the same. And I don't think in the end what's happened, and his party, even if he could have stomached doing it, weren't going to trust him to do a Brexit negotiation. And how would he look his European peer group in the eye when he came to negotiate a Brexit, having told them he could pull it off and keep Britain in? So it wasn't credible. So he has made the inevitably right decision.
And at that point, many in the Boris Johnson camp felt a bit miffed that he'd got in there and got this, first Conservative majority for 27 years. It's very hard, even though this is immense, it's huge, it is seismic. But when you look at it through the prism of two men who've been long-term rivals, it's intensely personal.
Yes, the Boris Cameron psychodrama has been going on for years, and it looks as though Boris has finally won that. We don't know whether he'll win the Tory leadership, and he still has a number of hurdles to overcome. He has really raised his standing in the parliamentary party over the campaign. A lot of Conservative MPs obviously backed Brexit. He also kept his cool during the TV debates when he was being attacked in a real onslaught, actually, during that TV debate. He'd been coached very hard not to rise to the bait. So he now has to build his standing amongst all Conservative MPs. He knows he's very popular with the party, but he just needs to get to that final two to be able to win that leadership contest.
Although I think we should hang on to the thought that most of Britain, at least witnessed by the last general election, is not Conservative. And so this needs to be, I think it was perhaps quite a big problem with the referendum campaign itself, that it was all a Tory psychodrama and often treated as such. We are talking about Britain's future, so it should be a bit more important than some projection of a schoolboy rivalry onto the national stage.
Ruth Davidson has spoken in the last few moments. Let's try and show you what she said. She's told us already this evening that the Tory party will stay together. And she said now it's right for the Prime Minister to offer stability while the country plots its course honourable to the last. But your sense is, Isabel, that she has already ruled herself out of being a future leader, even with the complications that she would have to jump over to get there in parliamentary terms.
I think Ruth Davidson will be a kingmaker in the Tory leadership contest. She is hugely popular in the Conservative Party and also in the media, and people really listen when she intervenes. But I don't get the sense that she wants to be Conservative Party leader. She's got a candidate who she's already named, who's Stephen Crabb, who's now the Work and Pensions Secretary, and I think you'll see
came in to replace Duncan Smith, of course.
Unfortunately for him, though, he campaigned for Remain, so that's going to be a serious black mark against him.
So basically, we are looking at a Brexit leader as Prime Minister?
Yes.
Yes.
Without a shadow of a doubt.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be amazed after all this if the Conservative Party's going to elect an inner, which is now a bust cause.
Theresa May did stay quiet during the campaign, I think strategically to have a go, but I don't think she's got enough standing in the parliamentary party anyway. I think someone very popular could have stayed quiet and potentially had a chance, but not Theresa May.
I asked you at the beginning of the night how many party leaders you thought would go by the end of the week. There are rumours within backbench Labour MPs now that they might mount a challenge against Jeremy Corbyn.
Although that wouldn't happen by the end of the week.
That could happen by the end of today.
I think there are, I mean, this is a very hard call for them. There's no doubt there are a lot of Labour MPs who are incandescent and have looked at what happened to their Labour heartlands. And yes, quite a lot of them are blaming Jeremy Corbyn. I imagine Jeremy Corbyn supporters are going to reply. One of the things they'll reply is, this is David Cameron's fault. Let's not lose sight of that. Jeremy Corbyn did not call this referendum. And the catch-22 is still there. You know, if Jeremy Corbyn were to be re-elected by the Labour members, or it looked likely that he would it be wise to make an attempt against him? And then we have to ask ourselves, I suppose we can cope, but can British politics cope with two leadership crises simultaneously? It doesn't normally happen.
And a Lib Dem leader with just 8 MPs.
There is real anger in the Labour Party, and I think if there's enough chaos in the Labour Party, even those who don't necessarily want to get rid of Corbyn may think that they have to get rid of him in order to stop the chaos.
We'll be back. I know we're expecting Boris Johnson, so, David, perhaps you should pick up from here.
Thank you very much, Emily. I don't know whether we are expecting Boris Johnson, but obviously we will. We're hoping to have a quick word with Peter Mandelson. We've just been joined, however, by Lord Tebbit, former chairman of the Conservative Party, one of the elder statesmen of the Conservative Party, if he doesn't mind me putting it like that. What do you make of all this?
It's a bit of a dog's dinner, isn't it? But I mean, the decision is the right decision that the people of the country have taken to leave the European Union. But it's led to an awful lot of confusion, hasn't it?
And the markets seem to have fallen through the floor, and the pound's fallen through the floor, and Kamal is saying it won't pick up for a long time.
Well, we'll see. We'll see.
It's project fear has become project reality.
Excuse me, my dear. We'll see. If these boys knew which way the market was going, they'd be much richer than they are.
I'm going to bring Peter Mandelson. Peter Mandelson is there on rather frowning at us, but I think it's only because he's not quite clear. Peter, good morning.
Good morning.
What do you make of what's happened? You were vehemently in favour of Britain staying in the EU. What's your reaction to what's happened and to the news of the Prime Minister going?
Well, I think that Mr. Cameron's announcement is entirely inevitable. I mean, he did it with his usual grace and elegance and composure. He looks and sounds like the Prime Minister, but I'm afraid that is no longer enough. What's happened in losing the referendum, he's seen his entire political project in the Conservative Party defeated. He wanted to turn it into a less nasty, more socially tolerant Liberal Party, and he made a great headway in that. But I'm afraid that those who chose as their instrument of revenge against him this referendum have won the day. The right wing now have the upper hand, and that's the direction in which the Conservative Party is now going to go.
Lord Tebbit, do you agree with that description?
Well, and
perhaps approve of what he's saying about the Tory Party?
If you look at which way many Labour heartlands have voted, you wouldn't say it was the extreme right wing that was running things.
That's right.
The grassroots of the Labour Party have overwhelmingly taken the view that Kate has taken.
Yeah. I mean,
can I just ask
Kate,
well, I mean, I just want to say, first of all, I did think the Prime Minister's speech was very magnanimous and, as would be expected, I think he's done the right thing because there is no need to rush to introduce Article 50. It gives time until we start those negotiations to be able to talk to people like Canada, Australia, India, those countries in the Commonwealth that we can actually start talking to now about how we're going to get deals with them. And the final thing I would just say is, I do feel that what we're losing in all of this is that the British people today voted, many of them, for hope. And they are feeling positive. And I think it's really important that we say to all those people that, I believe you've done the right thing, and we will see this in the end working out for the best for this country.
Peter Mandelson, do you think Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party did their utmost, strove their hardest to get this referendum to go in favour of Remain, or do you think the campaign was flawed and that Labour really didn't pull its weight?
I think eventually, but halfway through this main campaign, people like Tom Watson, the deputy leader, Ian McNicol, the general secretary, really tried to mobilise the party and its resources and to throw those behind Alan Johnson's campaign. The problem was that whilst they were able to do quite a lot on the ground, they did not have a voice from Jeremy Corbyn that was making any impact in the broadcast media. And I think the problem about Jeremy is not simply that he seemed to be travelling along through the entire referendum campaign with a sort of handbrake on, a sort of a doubtful Remainer. I think the real question about Jeremy is whether he has the capability, whether he has the competence to project the Labour Party, to put together an effective message and to get that message heard by Labour voters right across the country. It's signally obvious that on this occasion he was unable to do that, and I think he should reflect on why that was and whether he really has what it takes to be the sort of leader in the sort of modern age of politics that we need coming from the top of our party.
So might we be seeing a challenge to the leadership of the Labour Party running alongside a challenge for the leadership of the Conservative Party?
Well, that in the first instance is really a matter for the Parliamentary Labour Party, the Labour MPs. And I think they, like Jeremy himself, have got to reflect on what the implications are of the Labour Party so clearly losing touch with and losing a connection with its electoral base across the country.
I've got to interrupt you because Mark Carney, the Governor of the Bank of England, is just about to make a statement to the bank.
Inevitably, there'll be a period of uncertainty and adjustment following this result. But as the Prime Minister said just this morning, there'll be no initial change in the way our people can travel, in the way our goods can move, or the way our services can be sold. And it will take some time for the United Kingdom to establish new relationships with Europe and the rest of the world. So some market and economic volatility can be expected as this process unfolds. But we are well prepared for this. Her Majesty's Treasury and the Bank of England have engaged in extensive contingency planning, and the Chancellor and I have remained in close contact, including through the night and this morning. To be clear, the Bank of England will not hesitate to take additional measures as required, as markets adjust, and as the UK economy moves forward. Those economic adjustments will be supported by a resilient UK financial system, one that the Bank of England has consistently strengthened over the course of the last 7 years. The capital requirements of our largest banks are now 10 times higher than before the financial crisis. And the Bank of England has stress-tested those banks against scenarios far more severe than our country currently faces. As a result of these actions, UK banks have raised over £130 billion of new capital and now have more than £600 billion of high-quality liquid assets. So why does this matter? Well, that substantial capital and huge liquidity gives banks the flexibility they need to continue to lend to UK businesses and households, even during challenging times. Moreover, as a backstop, and to support the functioning of markets, the Bank of England stands ready to provide more than £250 billion of additional funds through its normal market operations. The Bank of England is also able to provide substantial liquidity in foreign currency if required. And we expect institutions to draw on this funding if and when appropriate, just as we expect them to draw on their own resources as needed in order to provide credit to support markets and to supply other financial services to the real economy. In the coming weeks, the bank will assess economic conditions, and we will consider any additional policy responses. A few months ago, the bank judged that the risks around the referendum were the most significant near-term domestic risks to financial stability. To mitigate them, the bank has put in place extensive contingency plans. And these plans begin with ensuring that the core of our financial system is well capitalized, is liquid, and is strong. This resilience is backed up by the Bank of England's liquidity facilities in sterling and foreign currencies, and all of these resources will support orderly market functioning in the face of any short-term volatility. The bank will continue to consult and cooperate with all relevant domestic and international authorities to ensure that the UK financial system can absorb any stresses and can do its job of concentrating on serving the real economy. That economy will adjust to new trading relationships that will be put in place over time. And it's these public and private decisions which will determine the UK's long-term economic prospects. The best contribution of the Bank of England, the best contribution we can make to this process, is to continue to pursue relentlessly our responsibilities for monetary and financial stability. These are unchanged, and we've taken all the necessary steps to prepare for today's events, and in the future, we will not hesitate to take any additional measures required to meet our responsibilities as the United Kingdom moves forward. Thank you very much.
Mark Carney, Governor of the Bank of England, saying they've got £250 billion they're prepared to spend to support sterling, and we'll never hesitate, we'll do what's needed. Is that bluff, or can he do all that?
It's certainly not bluff. You feel he's speaking directly to the markets. We have seen banking stocks this morning from the opening of the markets at 8 o'clock down by between 20 and 30%. Royal Bank of Scotland, Barclays Bank, Lloyds, all having a torrid time on the markets this morning. This is a man who is trying to prevent a political crisis turning into a banking crisis. Said that he will stand behind the British banks. He will enable them to provide credit, not just to businesses, but obviously to households as well. Absolutely vital part of the plumbing of the UK economy. But David, it is remarkable when you have the resignation of the Prime Minister, obviously, and then a statement from your governor of your central bank to reassure the markets. The very fact of that happening shows how nervous people like Mr. Carney are about what could happen. And of course, Mark Carney was the man who was the first to use the word recession when it came to the idea of Brexit, that Britain could fall into what he described as a technical recession. Whoever the new Prime Minister is of Britain by the end of the year, his relationship with the Governor of the Bank of England is going to be absolute key. And if that Prime Minister is somebody who felt that the Governor of the Bank of England was not somebody who seemed to support his position, I think that the Governor of the Bank of England is in a position where he's going to have to rebuild relations with the governing party.
But all those things you said, will it work?
They have at the moment, yes. His big point is, well, yes is too strong. His big point is that the banks are not in the same position as they were in 2007, when they had no capital buffers against big changes in the market. He is saying that they are now capitalised to a far greater extent. There's far more financial support, liquidity in the market. So it's not like we're back in 2007. But you have seen from the markets this morning that banks are still in a fragile state. They haven't recovered from the financial crisis in totality. And he is coming out and speaking directly to investors and saying the bank, and not just the Bank of England, but central banks around the world will do whatever is necessary, and that means providing liquidity to ensure that, as I say, this political crisis doesn't turn into a banking crisis.
See, yesterday we were told this was scaremongering, and here we are, can you believe it, this morning, actually talking about an economy that is now in this terrible shock, and people like me were told, you're scaremongering, we don't want to listen to the experts. I'm sorry, but all that has now been, unfortunately, God, I wish it were different, proved to be accurate. We have made a very, very, very bad mistake.
Lord Tebbit, are you alarmed at the reaction of the stock market and the banks to all this and
Not particularly
Mark
so.
Carney said? Not at all?
No, not particularly so. We envisaged that there would be this sort of reaction. After all, the Chancellor has been engaged in this hype about the disasters that would come to us ever since the dodgy dossier, which was issued by the government, or by the faction, the Remain faction in the government. They've been building it up. Now, of course, they've got to try and calm it down. But this is a cross which they've made for themselves. There is no reason to believe that over the next months or so that anything great is going to change. What's going to change?
Well, of course it was going to change.
What is going to change? Are the French going to refuse to buy?
And there's a lot of people making money out of it overnight as well. But, I mean, this is something that we always knew there would be...
Nigel, you're not listening to business.
Well, I think we will see...
To business.
Hold on a moment. Are the French going to refuse to buy the wings, the landing gear and the engines for the Airbus? Are they going to say we don't do business with Britain anymore? Of course they're not.
All right.
Are the Germans going to refuse to sell us motor cars?
Of course they will. Business said vote in, and
let's not take it any further for the moment. That will run and run, or one hopes the business will run and run. Jeremy, let's just have a look now, shall we? Because we're coming up towards 9 o'clock when we're going to hand over to others. Let's have a look with your delightful illustrations of the outcome of this referendum and how it came about.
Indeed, well, we started 11 hours ago here in our virtual Downing Street, and the drama has come right to the man behind the door of number 10. Let's just remind ourselves of the sequence here and take you right back to midnight. And the first result, which really was a warning sign for the Remain group, was Newcastle just after midnight. We'll just bring it on there. It went Remain, but only just. It was thought to be, expected to be, much stronger for Remain. So that was a flag right at the very start. Then Swansea came in, and it went for Leave. It had been predicted to go for Remain. Now, London began to report much better results for Remain. In Lambeth, it was between 70 and 80% of the vote that Remain won, in yellow there. But it wasn't enough. Even some of those London results, the Remain vote seemed a bit suppressed. And then we started hearing from the cities outside London, from Sheffield, for example, which went Remain, or Leave, I should say, even though we thought it might go Remain earlier in the evening. And then from Durham, one of the very big areas, 50-50 we had Durham down as, it went decisively for Leave. Birmingham was a much more balanced affair. So any chance Remain had of snatching it via the huge number of votes in Birmingham was gone. And at 6 in the morning, this happened. Northumberland took the numbers over the line for Leave. There was no way back for Remain. And finally, the last result came in all the way down here. It was Cornwall that reported for Leave. So a strong, decisive, clear victory for Leave, but many questions arising from it. And we've already seen the drama in Downing Street. What a night and what a day to come.
Jeremy, thank you very much indeed. Well, just before 10 o'clock last night when we started this programme, I said that it was a momentous day for Britain because it was no less than defining what kind of country we wanted to live in. And the answer to that question, which is one that's haunted politics for a long time, whether we should be in or out of the EU, has been resoundingly answered. A majority decided yesterday that they wanted us to leave the EU. What perhaps they didn't expect was that as an immediate consequence of that, David Cameron would announce that he was standing down as Prime Minister and that there would be, by October, a new leader of the Conservative Party. Whether that leads to another general election for a new Prime Minister trying to show that he has legitimacy is for the future. But we heard David Cameron with Samantha beside him, his voice breaking at the very end, saying that he was laying down this responsibility. He was there to steady the ship, but he wasn't the captain to take us out of the EU. Well, it's been an extraordinary night, but that is all from us here, from all of us in the studio, and everybody who's done all this number crunching and all the rest of it, from Emily, from Jeremy, from me, and from John, and from Dick, and from Harry, and old Uncle Tom Cobley. No, it's been a big and busy night, and thank them all very much. But our coverage does continue, because this is obviously going to be a story that develops during the day. Our coverage continues here on BBC One with Sophie Rayworth and Andrew Neil.
If we are to form the United States of Europe, we must begin now.
Despite Mr. Macmillan's friendship with de Gaulle, they came to nothing.
Britain has much to contribute to this process, and as members of the community, we shall be better able to do so.
What a jumper for it! Come on, we want to...
You see, yes is now showing at 67% and the no vote at 33%.
The President of the Commission, Mr. Delors, said at press conference the other day that he wanted the European Parliament to be the democratic body of the community, he wanted the Commission to be the executive, and he wanted the Council of Ministers to be the Senate. No, no, no.
I have to say, Mr. Speaker, that I find Winston Churchill's perception a good deal more convincing and more encouraging for the interest of our nation than the nightmare image sometimes conjured up by my right honourable friend.
Britain's best interests are served by suspending our membership of the exchange rate mechanism.
Like me or loathe me, don't bind my hands
when I am negotiating on behalf of the British nation.
L'euro, c'était un long chemin.
3 years ago, I committed to the British people that I would renegotiate our position in the European Union and hold an in-out referendum.
Well, at 20 minutes to 5, we can now say the decision taken in 1975 by this country to join the common market has been reversed by this referendum to leave the EU.
You did it! You did it!
It's unbelievable, isn't it?
You changed the face of Europe!
Well, I hope so.
I fought this campaign in the only way I know how, which is to say directly and passionately what I think and feel, head, heart and soul. I held nothing back. I was absolutely clear about my belief that Britain is stronger, safer and better off inside the European Union. In my view, we should aim to have a new Prime Minister in place by the start of the Conservative Party conference in October.